No Boundary by Ken Wilber. Chapter 1. Introduction. Who am I? Suddenly, without any warning, at any time or place, with no apparent cause, it can happen. All at once I found myself wrapped in a flame-colored cloud. For an instant I thought of fire and immense conflagration somewhere close by in that great city. The next I knew that the fire was within myself. Directly afterward there came upon me a sense of exultation, of immense joyousness accompanied or immediately followed by an intellectual illumination impossible to describe. Among other things, I did not merely come to believe, but I saw that the universe is not composed of dead matter, but is, on the contrary, a living presence. I became conscious in myself of eternal life. It was not a conviction that I would have an eternal life, but a consciousness that I possessed eternal life. Then I saw that all men are immortal, that the cosmic order is such that without any peradventure all things work together for the good of each and all, and that the foundational principle of the world, of all the worlds, is what we call love, and the happiness of each and all is, in the long run, absolutely certain. R.M. Buke. What a magnificent awareness! We would surely be making a grave error if we hastily concluded that such experiences to be hallucinations or products of mental aberration, for, in their final disclosure, they share none of the tortured anguish of psychotic visions. And then another quote. The dust and the stones of the street were as precious as gold. The gates were at first the ends of the earth. The green trees, when I saw them first, through one of the gates, transported and ravished me. Boys and girls tumbling in the street and playing were moving jewels. I knew not that they were born or should die, but all things abided eternally, as they were in their proper place. Eternity was manifest in the light of day. Treherne. William James, America's foremost psychologist, repeatedly stressed that, quote, our normal waking consciousness is but one special type of consciousness, while all about it, parted from it by the slimmest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. Unquote. It is as if our everyday awareness were but an insignificant island surrounded by a vast ocean of unsuspected and uncharted consciousness, whose waves beat continuously upon the barrier reefs of our normal awareness, until, quite spontaneously, they may break through, flooding our island awareness with knowledge of a vast, largely unexplored, but intensely real domain of New World consciousness. Another quote. Now came a period of rapture so intense that the universe stood still, as if amazed at the unutterable majesty of the spectacle. Only one in all the infinite universe, the all-loving, the perfect one. In that same wonderful moment of what might be called supernal bliss came illumination. I saw with intense inward vision the atoms or molecules of which seemingly the universe is composed. I know not whether material or spiritual, rearranging themselves as the cosmos, in its continuous everlasting life, passes from order to order. What joy when I saw that there was no break in the chain, not a link left out, everything in its place and time, worlds, systems, all blended into one harmonious whole. R.M. Buke. End quote. The most fascinating aspect of such awesome and illuminating experiences, and the aspect to which we will be devoting our much attention, is that the individual comes to feel beyond any shadow of a doubt that he or she is fundamentally one with the entire universe, with all worlds, high or low, sacred or profane. The sense of identity expands far beyond the narrow confines of the mind and body and embraces the entire cosmos. For just this reason, R.M. Buke referred to this state of awareness as cosmic consciousness. The Muslims call it supreme identity, supreme because it is an identity with the All. We will generally refer to it as unity consciousness, a loving embrace with the universe as a whole. Another quote. The streets were mine, the temple was mine, the people were mine, the skies were mine, and so were the sun and the moon and the stars, and all the world was mine, and I the only spectator and enjoyer of it. I knew no churlish properties, nor bounds, nor divisions, but all properties and divisions were mine, all treasures and possessors of them. So that with much ado I was corrupted and made to learn the dirty devices of the world, which I now unlearn and become, as it were, a little child again, that I might enter into the kingdom of God, Triherne. End of quote. So widespread is this experience of supreme identity that it has, among with the doctrines that purport to explain it, earned the name of the perennial philosophy. There is much evidence that this type of experience or knowledge is central to every major religion, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, so that we can justifiably speak of the transcendent unity of religions and the unanimity of primordial truth. The theme of this book is that this type of awareness, this unity consciousness or supreme identity, is the nature and condition of all sentient beings, but that we progressively limit our world and turn from our true nature in order to embrace boundaries. Our originally pure and non-dual consciousness then functions on various levels, with different identities and different boundaries. These different levels are basically the many ways we can and do answer the question, who am I? Who am I? The query has probably tormented humankind since the dawn of civilization, and remains today one of the most vexing of all human questions. Answers have been offered which range from the sacred to the profane, the complex to the simple, the scientific to the romantic, and the political to the individual. But instead of examining the multitude of answers to this question, let's look instead at the very specific and basic process which occurs when a person asks and then answers the question, who am I? What is my real self? What is my fundamental identity? When somebody asks, who are you? And you proceed to give a reasonable, honest, and more or less detailed answer, what, in fact, are you doing? What goes on in your head as you do this? In one sense, you are describing yourself as you have come to know it, including in your description most of the pertinent facts, both good and bad, worthy and worthless, scientific and poetic, philosophic and religious, that you understand as fundamental to your identity. You might, for example, think that I am a unique person, a being endowed with certain potentials. I am kind, but sometimes cruel, loving, but sometimes hostile. I am a father and a lawyer. I enjoy fishing and basketball. And so your list of feelings and thoughts might proceed. Yet there is an even more basic process underlying the whole procedure of establishing an identity. Something very simple happens when you answer the question, who are you? When you are describing or explaining or even just inwardly feeling yourself, what you are actually doing, whether you know it or not, is drawing a mental line or boundary across the whole field of your experience. And everything on the inside of that boundary you are feeling or calling yourself, while everything on the outside of the boundary you feel to be not self. Your self-identity, in other words, depends entirely upon where you draw that boundary line. You are a human and not a chair. You know that because you consciously or unconsciously draw a boundary line between humans and chairs, you are able to recognize your identity with the former. You may be a very tall human instead of a short one, so you may draw a mental line between tallness and shortness, and thus identify yourself as tall. You come to feel that I am this and not that by drawing a boundary line between this and that, and then recognizing your identity with this and your non-identity with that. So when you say myself, you draw a boundary line between what is you and what is not you. When you answer the question, who are you, you simply describe what's on the inside of that line. The so-called identity crisis occurs when you can't decide how and where you draw the line. In short, who are you means, where do you draw the boundary? All answers to that question, who am I, stem precisely from this basic procedure of drawing a boundary line between self and not self. Once the general boundary line has been drawn up, the answers to that question become very complex, scientific, theological, economic, or they may remain most simple and unarticulated, but any possible answer depends on first drawing the boundary line. The most interesting thing about this boundary line is that it can, and frequently does, shift. It can be redrawn. In a sense, the person can remap her soul and find in it territories she never thought possible, attainable, or even desirable. As we have seen, the most radical remapping or shifting of the boundary line occurs in experiences of the supreme identity, for here the person expands her self-identity boundary to include the entire universe. We might even say that she loses the boundary line altogether, for when she is identified with the one harmonious whole, there is no longer any outside or inside, and so nowhere to draw the line. Throughout this book, we will return to and examine the no-boundary awareness known as supreme identity. But at this point, it would be worthwhile to investigate some of the other more familiar ways in which one can define the boundaries of the soul. There are many different types of boundary lines, as many as there are individuals who draw them, but all of them fall into a handful of easily recognizable classes. The most common boundary line that individuals draw up or accept as valid is that of the skin boundaries surrounding the total organism. This seems to be a universally accepted self, not self boundary line. Everything on the inside of the skin boundary is in some sense me, while everything outside is not me. Something outside the skin boundary may be mine, but it's not me. For example, I recognize my car, my job, my house, my family. But they are definitely not directly me, in the same way all the things inside my skin are me. The skin boundary, then, is one of the most fundamentally accepted not self boundaries. We might think that this skin boundary is so obvious, so real, and so common that there wouldn't be any type of other boundaries really possible for there wouldn't be any other types of boundaries really possible for an individual, save perhaps those rare occurrences of unity of consciousness on the one hand, or hopelessly psychotic on the other. But in fact, there is another extremely common, well-established type of boundary line drawn by a vast number of individuals. For most people, while they recognize and accept as a matter of course the skin as the self-not-self boundary line, draw another, and for them more significant boundary within the organism itself. It is a boundary line within the organism. If a boundary line within the organism seems strange to you, then let me ask, do you feel you are a body, or do you feel you have a body? Most individuals feel they have a body, as if they owned or possessed it as much as they would a car, a house, or some other object. Under these circumstances, the body seems not so much me and mine, and what is mine, by definition, lies outside the self-not-self boundary. The person identifies more basically and intimately with just the facet of his total organism, and this facet, which he feels to be his real self, is known variously as the mind, the psyche, the ego, and the personality. Biologically, there is not the least foundation for this disassociation or radical split between the mind and the body, the psyche and the soma, the ego and the flesh, but psychologically it is epidemic. Indeed, the mind-body split and attendant dualism is a fundamental perspective of Western civilization. Notice even here that I must use the word psychology for the study of overall human behavior. The word itself reflects the prejudice that the human being is basically a mind and not a body. Even St. Francis referred to his body as a poor brother ass, and most of us do indeed feel that we just sort of ride around in our bodies like we would on a donkey or an ass. The boundary line between the mind and the body is certainly a strange one, but not at all present at birth. But as an individual begins to grow in years and begins to draw up and fortify his self-not-self boundary, he looks upon the body with mixed emotions. Should he directly include it within the boundary of his self, or is it to be viewed as foreign territory? Where is he to draw the line? On the other hand, the body is a source of much pleasure throughout life, from the ecstasies of erotic love to the subtleties of fine food and mellowness of sunsets taken in by the body senses. But on the other hand, the body houses the specter of crippling pain, debilitating disease, and torture of cancer. For a child, the body is the only source of pleasure, and yet it is the first source of pain and conflict with the parents. And on top of that, the body seems to be manufacturing waste products that, for reasons totally mystifying to the child, are a constant source of alarm and anxiety for the parents. Bedwetting, bowel movements, nose blowing. What an incredible fuss. And it's all tied with this, the body. Where to draw the line is going to be tough. But by the time the individual has matured, he has generally kissed poor brother ass goodbye, and the self-not-self boundary is finalized. Brother ass is definitely on the other side of the fence. The body becomes foreign territory, almost but never quite as foreign as the external word itself. The boundary is drawn between the mind and the body, and the person identifies squarely with the former. He comes to feel that he lives in his head, as if he were a miniature person in his skull giving directions and commands to his body, which may or may not obey. In short, what the individual feels to be his self-identity does not directly encompass the organism as a whole, but only a facet of that organism, namely his ego. That is to say, he identifies with a more or less accurate mental self-image, along with the intellectual and emotional processes associated with the self-image. Since he won't concretely identify with the total organism, the most he will allow is a picture or an image of the total organism. Thus he feels he is an ego, and that his body just dangles along under him. So we see here another major type of boundary line, one which establishes a person's identity as being primarily the ego, the self-image. As we can see, the self-not-self boundary line can be quite a flexible item, so it won't surprise us to find that even within the ego or mind, I am using these terms very loosely for the moment, yet another type of boundary line can be erected. For various reasons, some of which we will discuss later, the individual can even refuse to admit that some of the facets of her own psyche are hers. In psychological jargon, she alienates them, or represses them, or splits them off, or projects them. The point is that she narrows her self-not-self boundary to only certain parts of her egoic tendencies. This narrowed self-image we will be calling the persona, and its meaning will become more obvious as we proceed. But as the individual identifies with only facets of her psyche, the persona, the rest of her psyche is then actually felt to be not self, foreign territory, alien, and scary. She remaps her soul so as to deny and try to exclude from consciousness the unwanted aspects of herself, those unwanted aspects we call shadow. To a greater or lesser extent, the person becomes out of her mind. This, quite obviously, is another major and general type of boundary line. At this point, we are not trying to decide which of these types of self-maps is right, correct, or true. We are simply noting in our impartial fashion that there are indeed several major types of the self-not-self boundary line. And since we are approaching this topic in a non-judgmental way, we can at least mention one other type of boundary line that is today receiving much attention, namely the boundary associated with the so-called transpersonal phenomena. Transpersonal means that some sort of process is occurring in the individual that, in a sense, goes beyond the individual. The simplest instance of this extrasensory perception, or ESP. The simplest instance of this is extrasensory perception, or ESP. Parapsychologists recognize several forms of ESP: telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, retrocognition. We might also include out-of-body experiences, experiences of the transpersonal self or witness, peak experiences, and so on. What all of these events have in common is an expansion of the self, not self, boundary beyond the skin boundary of the organism. Although the transpersonal experiences are somewhat similar to unity consciousness, the two should not be confused. In unity consciousness, the person's identity is with the all, with absolutely everything. In transpersonal experiences, the person's identity doesn't quite expand to the whole, but it does expand, or at least extend beyond the skin boundary of the organism. He's not identified with the all, but neither is his identity confined solely to the organism. Whatever one may think of the transpersonal experience, we will discuss many of them in detail later in this book, the evidence that at least some forms of them do exist is overwhelming. Yet we can safely conclude that these phenomena represent yet another class of self-boundary lines. The point of this discussion of self and not self boundaries is that there are not just one, but many levels of identity available to an individual. These levels of identity are not theoretical postulates, but observable realities. You can verify them in and for yourself. As regards these different levels, it's almost as if that familiar yet ultimately mysterious phenomenon we call consciousness were a spectrum, a rainbow-like affair composed of numerous bands or levels of self-identity. Notice that we have briefly outlined 5 classes or levels of identity. There are certainly variations of these 5 major levels, and the levels themselves can be extensively subdivided, but these 5 levels appear to be basic aspects of human consciousness. Let us take these major levels of identity and arrange them in some sort of order. This spectrum-like arrangement is represented in Figure 1, which shows the self-not-self boundary line and the major levels of identity we discussed. Each different level results from the different places people can and do draw boundaries. Notice that the boundary line starts to break up towards the top spectrum, Figure 1, in the area we are calling transpersonal, and that it disappears entirely at the level of unity conscious, because at that ultimate level, self and not self become one harmonious whole. So the graph shows at the bottom 2 lines that go long, total organism and unity consciousness on the bottom, total organism above that, and transpersonal bands between it. And then there's the ego level above the total organism, and the personal level above that. And then there's a line that goes through all of it, except at the bottom towards unity consciousness it becomes dotted. And on either side of the line of the persona level, there's one side there's persona, on the other side there's shadow. On the ego level, on one side there's ego, on the other side there's body, and on the total organism, there's on one side there's total organism or a centaur, and on the other side there's environment. And then in unity consciousness, you don't have a divide, and it says transpersonal bands, universe, manifest, and unmanifest. So that's what the graph is. So we'll go back to the reading. It's obvious that each successive level of the spectrum represents a type of narrowing or restricting of what the individual feels to be his self, his true identity, his answer to the question, who are you? At the base of the spectrum, the person feels that he is one with the universe, that his real self is not just his organism, but all of creation. At the next level of the spectrum, or moving up the spectrum, the individual feels that he is not one with the all, but rather one with just his total organism. His total sense of identity has shifted and narrowed from the universe to the whole, as a whole, to the facet of the universe, namely his own organism. And the next level, his self-identity is narrowed once again, for now he identifies mainly with his ego or mind, which is not only a facet of his total which is only a facet of his total organism. And on the final level of the spectrum, he can now even narrow his identity to facets of his mind, alienating and repressing the shadow or unwanted aspects of his psyche. He identifies with only a part of his psyche, a part we call the persona. Thus, from the universe to a facet of the universe called the organism, from the organism to a facet of the organism called the ego, from the ego to the facet of the ego called the persona, such are some of the major bands of the spectrum of consciousness. With each successive level of the spectrum, there are more and more aspects of the universe which appear to be external to the person's self. Thus, at the level of the total organism, the environment appears outside the self-boundary, foreign, external, not self, but at the level of the persona, the individual's environment and his body and aspects of his own psyche appear external, foreign, not self. The different levels of the spectrum represent differences not only in self-identity, important as that is, but also in those characteristics which are directly or indirectly bound up with this self-identity. Think, for example, of the common problem of self-conflict. Obviously, since there are different levels of self, there are different levels of self-conflict as well. The reason is that at each level of the spectrum, the boundary line of a person's self is drawn up in different fashion. But a boundary line, as any military expert will tell you, is also a potential battle line, for a boundary line marks off the territory of two opposed and potentially warring camps. Thus, for example, a person on the level of the total organism will find the potential enemy in her environment, for it appears foreign, external, and therefore threatening to her life and well-being. But a person on the ego finds that not only her environment, but also her own body are foreign territory, the same foreign territory, and thus the nature of her conflicts and upset is dramatically different. She has shifted the boundary line of herself, and therefore shifted the battle line of her conflicts and personal wars, and in that case her body has gone over to the enemy. This battle line can become acutely prominent on the persona level, for here the individual has drawn the boundary line between the facets of her own psyche, and thus the battle line is now between the individual as persona versus her environment, and her body, and aspects of her own mind. The point is that as an individual draws up the boundaries of her soul, she establishes at the same time the battles of her soul. The boundaries of an individual's identity mark off what aspects are to be considered not self. So at each level of the spectrum, different aspects of the world appear to be not self, alien and foreign. Each level sees different processes of the universe as strangers to it, and since, as Freud once remarked, every stranger seems an enemy, every level is potentially engaged in different conflicts with various enemies. Every boundary line, remember, is also a battle line, and the enemy on each level is different. In psychological jargon, different symptoms originate from different levels. The fact that different levels of the spectrum possess different characteristics, symptoms, and potentials brings us to one of the most interesting points of this view. There is today an incredibly vast and growing interest in all sorts of schools and techniques dealing with various aspects of consciousness. People are flocking to psychotherapy, Jungian analysis, mysticism, psychosynthesis, Zen, transcendental analysis, Rolfing, Hinduism, bioenergetics, psychoanalysis, yoga, and Gestalt. What these schools have in common is that, in one way or another, they are all trying to effect change in a person's consciousness. But there the similarity ends. The individual, sincerely interested in increasing his self-knowledge, is faced with such a bewildering variety of psychological and religious systems that he hardly knows where to begin, whom to believe. Even if he carefully studies all the major schools of psychology and religion, he is apt to come out just as confused as he went in, for these various schools, taken as a whole, defiantly contradict one another. For example, in Zen Buddhism, one is told to forget, or transcend, or see through one's ego, but in psychoanalysis, one is helped to strengthen, fortify, and entrench one's ego. Which is right? This is a very real problem for the interested layperson as well as the professional therapist. So many different and conflicting schools, all aimed at understanding the very same person. Or are they? That is, are they all aimed at the same level of a person's consciousness? Or is it rather that these different approaches are actually approaches to different levels of a person's self? Could it be that these different approaches, far from being conflicting or contradictory, actually reflect the very real differences in the various levels of the spectrum of consciousness? And could it be that these different approaches are all more or less correct when working with their own major level? If this is true, it allows us to introduce a great deal of order and coherence into this otherwise maddeningly complex field. It would become apparent that all these different schools of psychology and religion do not so much represent contradictory approaches to individuals and their problems, but rather complementary approaches to different levels of the individual. With this understanding, the vast field of psychology and religion breaks up into 5 or 6 manageable groups, and it becomes obvious that each of these groups is aiming predominantly at one of the major bands of the spectrum. Thus, to give just a few very brief and general examples, the aim of psychoanalysis and the most forms of conventional psychotherapy is to heal the radical split between the conscious and the unconscious aspects of the psyche, so that a person is put in touch with all of his mind. These therapies aim at reuniting the persona and shadow so as to create a strong and healthy ego, which is to say, an accurate and acceptable self-image. In other words, they are all oriented towards the ego level. They seek to help an individual living as a persona to remap the self as ego. Beyond this, however, the aim of most so-called humanistic therapies is to heal the split between the ego itself and the body, to reunite the psyche and soma so as to reveal the total organism. This is why humanistic psychology, called the third force, the other two major forces in psychology being psychoanalysis and behaviorism, is also referred to as the human potential movement. In extending a person's identity from just the mind or ego to the entire organism as a whole, the vast potentials of the total organism are liberated and put at the individual's disposal. Going deeper still, we find the aim of such disciplines as Zen Buddhism or Vedanta Hinduism is to heal the split between the total organism and the environment, to reveal an identity, a supreme identity with the entire universe. They are aiming, in other words, for the level of unity consciousness. But let us not forget that between the level of unity consciousness and the level of the total organism, there are transpersonal bands of the spectrum. The therapies addressing this level are deeply concerned with those processes in the persona which are actually supra-individual or collective or transpersonal. Some of them even refer to transpersonal self. And while this transpersonal self is not identical with the all, that would be unity consciousness, it nevertheless transcends the boundaries of the individual organism. Among the therapies aiming at this level are psychosynthesis, Jungian analysis, various preliminary yoga practices, transcendental meditation techniques, and so on. All of this is, of course, a very simplified version of things, but it does point out that the general fashion in which most of the major schools of psychology, psychotherapy, and religion are simply addressing the different major levels of the spectrum. Some of these correspondences are shown in Figure 2, where the major schools of therapy are listed beside the level of the spectrum towards which they fundamentally aim. I should mention that because, like any spectrum, these levels shade into one another quite a bit. No absolutely distinct and separate classification of the levels or the therapies addressing these levels is possible. Further, when I classify a therapy on the basis of the level of the spectrum it addresses, that means the deepest level which the therapy recognizes, either explicitly or implicitly. Generally speaking, you will find that a therapy of any given level will recognize and accept the potential existence of all of the levels above its own, but deny the existence of all those beneath it. So the graph again has the four vertical lines, and the bottom is the universe as divine. The next one up is the total organism, so unity consciousness. The next one up is total organism. The next one is ego level, and the next one is persona level. So we would know that persona level there's a split between persona and shadow, and the therapies and levels of the spectrum is for the persona level are simple counseling and supportive therapy. At the ego level, where the split is between the ego and the body, the therapies are psychoanalysis, psychodrama, transcendental analysis, cognitive therapy, and ego psychology. So then we have total organism, and so the split there is between total organism and the environment, and the therapies are bioenergetic analysis, Rogerian therapy, Gestalt therapy, existential analysis, logotherapy, and humanistic psychology. So then we have three transcendental bands, Jung's analytical psychology, psychosynthesis, and then Maslow and Progoff. And so those has the dots between them, so that's not really a split. And then we have unity consciousness, universe as divine. There's no split here. And we have the therapies as Vedanta Hinduism, Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism, Taoism, esoteric Islam, esoteric Christianity, and esoteric Judaism. So that's the graph. So we'll go back to the reading. As a layperson, layperson or therapist gains familiarity with the spectrum, its various levels and their different potentials and different problems, she will be better able to orient herself or her client in the journey of self-understanding and self-growth. She may be able to recognize more readily from which levels the present problems or conflicts stem, and thus apply to any given conflict the appropriate therapeutic process for that level. She may also come to recognize which potentials and levels she wishes to contact, as well as the procedures best suited to facilitate this growth. Growth fundamentally means an enlarging and expanding of one's horizons, a growth of one's boundaries, outwardly in perspective and inwardly in depth. But that is precisely the definition of descending the spectrum or ascending it, depending on which angle you prefer. I will in this book use descending simply because it much better matches the figure. And if you remember, at the bottom is the universe as divine, and at the top is the unity consciousness is at the bottom, and at the top is the personal level. All right. When a person descends a level of the spectrum, he has in effect remapped his soul to enlarge his territory. Growth is reapportionment, rezoning, remapping, and acknowledgement, and then enrichment of ever deeper and more encompassing levels of one's own self. In the next 3 chapters, we will be exploring some of the facets of the ultimate mystery called unity conscious, feeling our way into it, edging about it, sneaking up to it, only to have it sneak up on us from behind. Besides giving us some sort of feel to unity consciousness, this exploration will equip us with many of the necessary tools to understand the whole field of what is today called transpersonal psychology, noetics, or consciousness research. We will explore the world as it appears without limits and boundaries, the present moment as it appears without the boundaries of past and future, and awareness as it appears without the limits of inside and outside. We will then devote a chapter to explaining the growth of all the other levels of the spectrum, the level of the total organism, the level of the ego, the level of persona. Then, with this basic understanding behind us, we will begin the descent of the spectrum of consciousness, an experiential exploration of the various levels and the major therapies used to contract them, ending where we began with the level of unity consciousness. This is only appropriate for, as we will see, this is the only level that in all truth we have never been without. Chapter 2, half of it. Have you ever wondered why life comes in opposites, why everything you value is one of a pair of opposites, why all decisions are between opposites, why all desires are based on opposites? Notice that all spatial and directional dimensions are opposites, up versus down, inside versus outside, high versus low, long versus short, north versus south, big versus small, here versus there, top versus bottom, left versus right. And notice that all things we consider serious and important are one pole of a pair of opposites, good versus evil, life versus death, pleasure versus pain, God versus Satan, freedom versus bondage. So also our social and aesthetic values are always put in terms of opposites, success versus failure, beautiful versus ugly, strong versus weak, intelligent versus stupid. Even our highest abstractions rest on opposites. Logic, for instance, is concerned with what is true versus the false, epistemology with appearance versus reality, ontology with being versus non-being. The world seems to be a massive collection of opposites. This fact is so commonplace as to hardly need mentioning, but the more one ponders it, the more it is strikingly peculiar. For nature, it seems, knows nothing of this world of opposites in which people live. Nature doesn't grow true frogs and false frogs, nor moral trees and immoral trees, nor right oceans and wrong oceans. There is no trace in nature of ethical mountains and unethical mountains, nor are there even such things as beautiful species and ugly species, at least not to nature, for it is pleased to produce all kinds. Thoreau said nature never apologizes, and apparently it's because nature doesn't know the opposite of right and wrong, and thus doesn't recognize what humans might imagine to be errors. It is certainly true that some of the things which we call opposites appear to exist in nature. There are, for instance, big frogs and small frogs, large trees and small trees, ripe oranges and unripe oranges. But it isn't a problem for them. It doesn't even throw them into paroxysms of anxiety. There might even be smart bears and dumb bears, but it doesn't seem to concern them very much. You just don't find inferiority complexes in bears. Likewise, there is life and death in the world of nature, but again it doesn't seem to hold the terrifying dimensions ascribed to it in the world of humans. A very old cat isn't swept with torrents of terror over its impending death. It just calmly walks out to the woods, curls up under a tree, and dies. A terminally ill robin perches comfortably on the limb of a willow and stares into the sunset. When it can see the light no more, it closes its eyes for the last time and drops gently to the ground. How different from the way humans face death. Quote, "Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." Unquote. With pain and pleasure do appear in the world of nature. While pain and pleasure do appear in the world of nature, they are not problems to worry over. When a dog is in pain, it yelps. When not, it just doesn't worry about it. It doesn't dread future pain nor regret past pain. It seems to be a very simple and natural affair. We say all there is true. We say all that is true because, put simply, nature is dumb. But that won't quite do for a reason. We are just starting to realize that nature is much smarter than we would like to think. The great biochemist Albert Szent-Györgyi gives a whimsical example. Quote, "When I joined the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, I did this in the hope that by rubbing elbows with those great atomic physicists and mathematicians, I would learn something about living matter. But as soon as I revealed that in any living system there are more than 2 electrons, the physicists would not speak to me. With all their computers, they could not say that what the third electron might do. The remarkable thing is that it knows exactly what to do. So that little electron knows something that all the wise men of Princeton don't, and this can only be something very simple." End of quote. I am afraid that nature is not only smarter than we think, nature is smarter than we can think. Nature, after all, also produces the human brain, which we flatter ourselves to be one of the most intelligent instruments in the cosmos. And can a total idiot fashion a genuine masterpiece? According to the books of Genesis, one of the first tasks given to Adam was to name the animals and plants existing in nature. For nature doesn't come ready labeled with such tags. It would be a great convenience if we could classify and name all of the various aspects of the nature world. Adam, in other words, was charged with sorting out the complexity of nature's forms and processes and assigning names to these. These animals look like one another, and they don't resemble those animals at all. So let's call this group lions and that group bears. Let's see, you can eat this group of things, but not that group. Let's call this group grapes and that group rocks. But Adam's real task was not so much thinking up names for the animals and plants laboriously as that undoubtedly was. Rather, the crucial part of his job was the sorting out process itself. For, unless there were only one of each animal, which is unlikely, Adam had to group together those animals which were similar and learn to mentally differentiate them from dissimilar ones. He had to learn to draw a mental boundary line between the various groups of animals, because only after he did this could he fully recognize and therefore name the different beasts. In other words, the great task Adam initiated was the construction of mental or symbolic dividing lines. Adam was the first to delineate nature, to mentally divide it up, mark it off, diagram it. Adam was the first great map maker. Adam drew boundaries. So successful was this mapping of nature that, to this day, our lives are largely spent in drawing boundaries. Every decision we make, our every action, our every word is based on the construction, conscious or unconscious, of boundaries. I am not now referring to just a self-identity boundary, important as that certainly is, but to all boundaries that, in the broadest sense. To make a decision means to draw a boundary line between what to choose and what not to choose. To desire something means to draw a boundary line between pleasurable and painful things, and then to move towards the former. To maintain an idea means to draw a boundary line between the concepts felt to be true and concepts felt to be not true. To receive an education is to learn where and how to draw boundaries, and then what to do with the bounded aspects. To maintain a judicial system is to draw a boundary line between those who fit society's rules and those who don't. To fight a war is to draw a boundary line between those who are for us and those who are against us. To study ethics is to learn how to draw a boundary line disclosing good and evil. To pursue Western medicine is to draw with great clarity a boundary line between sickness and health. Quite obviously, from minor incidents to major crises, from small decisions to big deals, From mild preferences to flaming passions, our lives are a process of drawing boundaries. The peculiar thing about a boundary line is that, however complex and rarefied it might be, it actually marks off nothing but an inside versus an outside. For example, we can draw the very simplest form of a boundary line as a circle and see that it discloses an inside versus an outside. So here we have a picture with a circle, and on the inside of the circle it says inside, and then outside next to the circle it says outside. But notice that the opposites of inside versus outside don't exist in themselves until we drew the boundary of the circle. It is the boundary line itself, in other words, which creates a pair of opposites. In short, to draw boundaries is to manufacture opposites. Thus we can start to see the reason we live in a world of opposites is precisely because life, as we know it, is a process of drawing boundaries. And the world of opposites is a world of conflict, as Adam himself would soon discover. Adam must have been fascinated with the power generated by drawing boundary lines and invoking names. Imagine a simple sound such as sky would represent the whole immensity and vastness of the blue heavens, which were, by the power of a boundary line, recognized to be different from the earth, from water, from fire. So instead of handling and manipulating real objects, Adam could manipulate in his head these magic names, which stood for the objects themselves. Before the invention of boundaries and names, for example, if Adam wanted to tell Eve that he thought she was dumb as a jackass, he had to grab Eve and then wander around until he found a jackass, point to the jackass, point to Eve, jump up and down, grunt, and make stupid faces. But now, with the magic of words, Adam could just look up and say, "God heavens, my dear, you are quite as dumb as a jackass." Eve, who, by the way, was really much wiser than Adam, usually held her tongue. That is, she declined to reciprocate with word magic, for she knew in her heart the words were a two-edged sword, and that he who lives by the sword perishes by the sword. In the meantime, the results of Adam's endeavors were spectacular, powerful, magical, and he understandably started to get a little cocky. He started extending boundaries into, and thus gained knowledge over, places that were better left uncharted. This cocky behavior accumulated at the tree of knowledge, which was really the tree of the opposite of good and evil. And when Adam recognized the difference between the opposites of good and evil, that is, when he drew a fatal boundary, his world fell apart. When Adam sinned, the entire world of opposites, which he himself had helped to create, returned to plague him. Pain versus pleasure, good versus evil, life versus death, toil versus play. The whole array of conflicting opposites swept down on humankind. The exasperating fact which Adam learned was that every boundary line is also a pointed potential battle line, so that just to draw a boundary is to prepare oneself for conflict. Specifically, the conflict of the war of opposites, the agonizing fight of life against death, pleasure against pain, good against evil. What Adam learned, and learned too late, is that, quote, where to draw the line, unquote, really means, quote, where the battle is to take place, unquote. The simple fact is that we live in a world of conflict and opposites because we live in a world of boundaries. Since every boundary line is also a battle line, there is a human predicament. The firmer one's boundaries, the more entrenched are one's battles. The more I hold onto pleasure, the more I necessarily fear pain. The more I pursue goodness, the more I am obsessed with evil. The more I seek success, the more I dread failure. The harder I cling to life, the more terrifying death becomes. The more I value anything, the more obsessed I become with its loss. Most of our problems, in other words, are problems of boundaries and the opposites they create. Now, our habitual way of trying to solve these problems is to attempt to eradicate one of the opposites. We handle the problem of good versus evil by trying to exterminate evil. We handle the problem of life versus death by trying to hide death under symbolic immortalities. In philosophy, we handle conceptual opposites by dismissing one of the poles or trying to reduce it to the other. The materialist tries to reduce mind to matter, while the idealist tries to reduce matter to mind. The monists try to reduce plurality to unity. The pluralists try to explain unity as plurality. The point is that we always tend to treat the boundary as real and then manipulate the opposite created by the boundary. We never seem to question the existence of the boundary itself. Because we believe the boundary to be real, we staunchly imagine the opposites are irreconcilable, separate, forever set apart. East is east, and west is west, and never the twain shall meet. God and Satan, life and death, good and evil, love and hate, self and other. These are as different, we say, as night and day. Thus we suppose that life would be perfectly enjoyable if we could only eradicate all the negative and unwanted poles of the pairs of opposites. If we could vanquish pain, evil, death, suffering, sickness, and so that goodness, life, joy, and health would abound, then indeed would be a good life, and in fact, that is precisely many people's idea of heaven. Heaven has come to mean not a transcendence of all opposites, but the place where all the positive halves of the pairs of opposites are accumulated, while hell is the place where are massed all the negative halves: pain, suffering, torment, anxiety, sickness. The goal of separating the opposites and then clinging to or pursuing the positive halves seems to be a distinguishing characteristic of progressive Western civilization. It's religion, science, medicine, history. Progress, after all, is simply progress toward the positive and away from the negative. Yet despite the obvious comforts of medicine and agriculture, there is not the least bit of evidence to suggest that, after centuries of accentuating positives and trying to eliminate negatives, humanity is any happier, more content, or more at peace with itself. In fact, the available evidence suggests just the contrary. Today is the age of anxiety, of future shock, of epidemic frustration and alienation, of boredom in the midst of wealth and meaningless in the midst of plenty. It seems that progress and unhappiness might well be flip sides of the same restless coin. For the very urge to progress implies a discontent with the present state of affairs, so that the more I seek progress, the more acutely I feel discontent. In blindly pursuing progress, our civilization has, in effect, institutionalized frustration. For in seeking to accentuate the positive and eliminate the negative, we have forgotten entirely that the positive is defined only in terms of the negative. The opposites might indeed be as different as night and day, but the essential point is that without night, we would not even be able to recognize something called day. To destroy the negative is, at the same time, to destroy all possibility of enjoying the positive. Thus, the more we succeed in this adventure of progress, the more we actually fail, and hence the more acute becomes our sense of total frustration. The root of the whole difficulty is our tendency to view the opposites as irreconcilable, as totally set apart and divorced from one another, for even the simplest of opposites, such as buying versus selling, are viewed as two different and separate events. Now, it is true that buying and selling are in some sense different, but they are also, and this is the point, completely inseparable. Anytime you buy something, someone else has, in the same action, sold something. In other words, buying and selling are simply two ends of one event, namely the single business transaction itself. And while these two ends of a transaction are different, the single event which they represent is one and the same. In just the same way, all of the opposites share an implicit identity. That is, however vividly the differences between these opposites may strike us, they nevertheless remain completely inseparable and mutually interdependent, and for the same reason that one could not exist without the other. Look at it this way. There is obviously no inside without an outside, no up without a down, no win without a loss, no pleasure without pain, no life without death. Says the old Chinese sage Lao Tzu, quote, "Is there a difference between yes and no? Is there a difference between good and evil? Must I fear what others fear? What nonsense! Having and not having arise together, difficult and easy complement each other, long and short contrast each other, high and low rest upon each other, front and back follow one another." Chang Tzu elaborates. Thus, those who say that they would have right without its correlates wrong, or good government without its correlate misrule, do not apprehend a great principle of the universe, nor the nature of all creation. One might as well talk of the existence of heaven without that of earth, or of the negative principle without the positive, which is clearly impossible. Yet people keep on discussing it without stop. Such people must either be fools or knaves. End of quote. The inner unity of opposites is hardly an idea confined to mystics, Eastern or Western. If we look to modern-day physics, the field in which the Western intellect has made its greatest advances, then we find that what we find is another version of reality as a union of opposites. In relativity theory, for example, the old opposite of rest versus motion have become totally indistinguishable. That is, each is both. An object which appears at rest for one observer is, at the same time, in motion for a different observer. Likewise, the split between wave and particle vanishes into wavicles, and the contrast of structure versus function evaporates. Even the age-old separation of mass from energy has fallen to Einstein's E equals mc squared. And these ancient opposites are not viewed as merely two aspects of one reality, a reality into which Hiroshima so violently bore witness. Likewise, such opposites as subject versus object and time versus space are now seen as being so mutually interdependent that they form an interwoven continuum, a single unified platform. What we call subject and object are alike, buying and selling, just two different ways of approaching one single process. And because the same holds true for time and space, we can no longer speak of an object being located in space or happening in time, but only of a space-time occurrence. Modern physics, in short, proclaims that reality can only be considered a union of opposites. In the words of biophysicist Ludwig von Bertalanffy, if what has been said is true, reality is what Nicholas of Cursus called the coincidentia oppositorum. Discursive thinking always represents only one aspect of ultimate reality, called God in Curtis's terminology. It can never exhaust its infinite manifoldness. Hence, ultimate reality is a unity of opposites. End of quote. From the viewpoint of coincidentia oppositorium, the coincidence of opposites, what we thought were totally separable, or separate and irreconcilable opposites, turn out to be, in von Bertalanffy's phrase, complementary aspects of one and the same reality. It is for all these reasons that Alfred North Whitehead, one of the most influential philosophers of the century, set forth his philosophy of organism and vibratory existence, which suggests that all the ultimate elements are in their essence vibratory, that is, all things and events we usually consider are irreconcilable, such as cause and effect, past and future, subject and object, are actually just like the crest and trough of a single wave, a single vibration. For a wave, although itself a single event, only expresses itself through the opposite of crest and trough, high point and low point. For that very reason, the reality is not found in the crest nor in the trough alone, but in their unity. Try to imagine a wave with crests but no troughs. Obviously, there's no such thing as a crest without a trough, a high point without a low point. Crest and trough, indeed all opposites, are inseparable aspects of one underlying activity. Thus, as Whitehead puts it, each element of the universe is a vibratory ebb and flow of an underlying energy or activity. Nowhere in this inner unity of opposites set forth more nowhere is this inner unity of opposites set forth more clearly than in the Gestalt theory of perception. According to Gestalt, we are never aware of any object or event or figure save in relation to a contrasting background. For example, something we call light is really a light figure standing out against a dark background. When I look up to the heavens on a dark sky and perceive the brilliance of a bright star, what I am really seeing, what my eye actually really takes in, is not the separate star, but the entire field or gestalt of bright star plus dark background. However drastic the contrast between the bright star and its background of darkness, the point is that without the one I could never perceive the other. Light and dark are thus two correlative aspects of one single sensory gestalt. Likewise, I cannot perceive motion except in relation to rest, nor effort without ease, nor complexity without simplicity, nor attraction without repulsion. In the same way, I am never aware of pleasure except in relation to pain. I might indeed be feeling very comfortable and pleasurable at this moment, but I would never be able to realize that if it were not for the background existence of discomfort and pain. This is why pleasure and pain always seem to alternate, for it is only in their mutual contrast and alternation that the existence of each can be recognized. Thus, as much as I like the one and loathe the other, the attempt to isolate them is futile. As Whitehead would say, pleasure and pain are just the inseparable crest and trough of a single wave of awareness, and to try to accentuate the positive crest and eliminate the negative one is to try to eliminate the wave of awareness itself. Perhaps we can begin to understand why life, when viewed as a world of separate opposites, is so totally frustrating and why progress has actually become not a growth but a cancer. In trying to separate the opposites and cling to those we judge positive, such as pleasure without pain, life without death, good without evil, we are really striving after phantoms without the least reality. Might as well strive for a world of crusts with no troughs, spires, and no cellars, lefts and no rights, ins and no outs. Thus, as Wittgenstein points out, because our goals are not lofty but illusory, our problems are not difficult but nonsensical. That all opposites, such as mass and energy, subject and object, life and death, are so much each other that they are perfectly inseparable, still strikes most of us as hard to believe. But this is only because we accept as real the boundary line between the opposites. It is, recall, the boundaries themselves which create the seeming existence of separate opposites. To put it plainly, to say that the ultimate reality is a unity of opposites is actually to say that in ultimate reality there are no boundaries anywhere. The fact is, we are so bewitched by boundaries, so under the spell of Adam's sin, that we have totally forgotten the actual nature of boundary lines themselves. The boundary lines, like any type, are never found in the real world itself, but only in the imagination of the map makers. To be sure, there are many kinds of lines in the natural world, such as the shoreline, situated between continents, and the oceans surrounding them. There are, in fact, all sorts of lines and surfaces in nature, outlines of leaves and skins of organisms, and skylines and tree lines and lake lines and surfaces of light and shade, and lines setting off all objects from their environment. Obviously, those surfaces and lines are actually there, but those lines, such as the shoreline between land and water, don't merely represent a separation of land and water, as we generally suppose. As Alan Watts pointed out so often, these so-called dividing lines equally represent precisely those places where the land and the water touch each other. That is, those lines join and unite just as much as they divide and distinguish. These lines, in other words, aren't boundaries. There is a vast difference between a line and a boundary, as we shall presently see. The point, then, is that lines join opposites as well as distinguish them, and that precisely in the essence and function of all real lines and surfaces in nature. That is the essence and function of all real lines and surfaces in nature. They explicitly mark off the opposites while at the same time they implicitly unify them. For example, let's draw the line representing a concave figure. So we have a concave line. And on one side it says concave on the inside of the concave, and the other side says convex with a parenthesis around the convex. But notice immediately that with this very same line, I have also created a convex figure. That is what Taoist sage Lao Tzu meant when he said that all the opposites arise simultaneously and mutually. Like concave and convex in this example, they come into existence together. Further, we cannot say that the line separates convex from concave, because there is only one line, and it is wholly shared by both. The line, far from separating convex and concave, make it absolutely impossible for the one to exist without the other. Because of that single line, no matter how we draw a concave, we also draw a convex, because the outline of the concave is the inline of the convex. Thus you will never find a concave without a convex. For these, like all our opposites, are fated to intimately embrace one another for all time. The point is that all the lines we find in nature, or even construct ourselves, do not merely distinguish different opposites, but also bind the two together in inseparable unity. A line, in other words, is not a boundary. For a line, whether mental, natural, or logical, doesn't just divide and separate, it also joins and unites. Boundaries, on the other hand, are pure illusions. They pretend to separate what is not in fact separable. In this sense, the actual world contains lines but no real boundaries. A real line becomes an illusory boundary when we imagine its two sides to be separated and unrelated. That is, when we acknowledge the outer difference of the two opposites but ignore their inner unity. A line becomes a boundary when we forget that the inside coexists with the outside. A line becomes a boundary when we imagine that it just separates but doesn't unite at the same time. It is fine to draw lines, provided we do not mistake them for boundaries. It is fine to distinguish pleasure from pain. It is impossible to separate pleasure from pain. Now, we generate the illusions of boundaries in as much the same way as Adam originally did, for the sins of the father have been visited on their sons and daughters. We begin by either following the lines of nature, shorelines, forest lines, skylines, rock surfaces, skin surfaces, and so on, or by constructing our own mental lines, which are ideas and concepts. By this process, we sort out and classify aspects of our world. We learn to recognize the differences between the inside and the outside of our classes, between what are rocks and what are not rocks, between what is pleasure and what is not pleasure, between what is tall and what is not tall, between what is good and what is not good. Already our lines are in danger of becoming boundaries, for we are recognizing explicit differences and forgetting the implicit unity. And this error is facilitated as we proceed to name, to attach a word or symbol to the inside, the outside of the class. For the words we use for the inside of the class, such as light, up, pleasure, are definitely detachable and separable from the words we use for the outside of the class, such as dark, down, and pain. Thus, we can manipulate the symbols independently of their mandatory opposites. For instance, I can create a sentence which says, I want pleasure, and there is no reference in that sentence to pleasure's necessary opposite, pain. I can separate pleasure and pain in words, in my thoughts, and even in the real world, the one is never found apart from the other, even though in the real world, the one is never found apart from the other. At the same point, the line between pleasure and pain becomes a boundary, and the illusion that the two are separate seems convincing. Not seeming that the opposite are just two different names for one process, I imagine that there are two different processes set against each other. Commenting on this, L.L. Wyatt said that, quote, thus the immature mind, unable to escape its own prejudice, is condemned to struggle in the straitjacket of its dualism: subject, object, time, space, spirit, matter, freedom, necessity, free will, law. The truth, which must be single, is ridden with contradiction. Man cannot think where he is, for he has created two worlds from one, unquote. Our problem, it seems, is that we create a conventional map complete with boundaries of the actual territory of nature which has no boundaries, and then thoroughly confuse the two. As Korbisky and the general semanticists have pointed out, our words, symbols, signs, and thoughts and ideas are merely maps of reality, not reality itself, because the map is not the territory. The word water won't satisfy your thirst, but we live in the world of maps and words as if it were real, the real world. Following in the footsteps of Adam, we have become totally lost in a world of purely fantasy, the pure fantasy maps and boundaries. And these illusory boundaries, with the opposites they create, have become our impassioned battles. Most of our problems of living, then, are based on the illusion that the opposite canon should be separated and isolated from one another. But since all opposites are actually aspects of one underlying reality, this is like trying to totally separate two ends of a singular rubber band. All you can do is pull harder and harder until something violently snaps. Thus, we might be able to understand that with all the mystical traditions the world over, one who sees through the illusion of the opposites is called liberated, because he is freed from the pairs of opposites. He is freed in this life from the fundamentally nonsensical problems and conflicts involved in the war of opposites. He no longer manipulates the opposites one against the other in his search for peace, but instead transcends them both. Not good versus evil, but beyond good and evil. Not life against death, but a center of awareness that transcends both. The point is not to separate the opposites and make positive progress, but rather to unify and harmonize the opposites, both positive and negative, by discovering a ground which transcends and encompasses them both. And that ground, as we shall soon see, is unity consciousness itself. In the meantime, let us note, as does the Hindu scripture Bhagavad-gita, that liberation is not freedom from the negative, but freedom from the pairs altogether. And I quote here, content with getting what arrives of itself, passed beyond the pairs, free from envy, not attached to success nor failure, even acting he is not bound. He is to be recognized as eternally free, who neither loathes nor craves, for he that is freed from the pairs is easily freed from conflict. End quote. This being freed from the pairs is, in Western times, the discovery of the kingdom of heaven on earth, even though the popular evangelists have forgotten it. For heaven is not, as pop religions would have it, a state of all positives and no negatives, but a state of realizing no opposites, or no two-ness. At last, according to the Gospel of St. Thomas, here we quote, they said to him, "Shall we then, being children, enter the kingdom?" Jesus said to them, "When you make the two one, and when you make the inner as the outer, and the outer as the inner, and the above as the below, and when you make the male and the female into a single one, then you shall enter the kingdom of heaven." Well, it just says, "Then you shall enter the kingdom." End of quote. The idea of no opposites and not two-ness is the essence of Advaita Hinduism. Advaita means non-dual or not two, and of Mahayana Buddhism. The idea is beautifully expressed in one of the most important Buddhist texts, the Lankavatara Sutra. Quote, false imagination teaches us that such things as light and shade, long and short, black and white are different and are to be discriminated. But they are not independent of each other. They are only different aspects of the same thing. They are terms of relation, not reality. Conditions of existence are not one of mutually exclusive character. In essence, things are not two, but one. End quote. We could multiply these quotes indefinitely, but they would all point to the same thing. Ultimate reality is a union of opposites, and since it is expressly the boundaries which we superimpose on reality that slice it into innumerable pairs of opposites, the claim that all these traditions that reality is freed from the pair of opposites is a claim that reality is freed from all boundaries. That reality is not two means that reality is no boundary. Thus the solution to the war of the opposite requires surrendering of all boundaries, not the progressive juggling of the opposites against each other. The war of opposites is a symptom of a boundary taken to be real. To cure the symptoms, we must go to the root of the matter itself, our illusory boundaries. But we ask, what will happen to our drive for progress if we see all the opposites as one? Well, with any luck, it will stop, and with it that peculiar discontent that thrives on the illusion that the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. But we should be clear about this. I do not mean we will cease making advancements of a sort in medicine, agriculture, or technology. We will only choose to harbor the illusion that happiness depends on it. We will only cease to harbor the illusion that happiness depends on it. For when we see through the illusions of our boundaries, we will see, here and now, the universe as Adam saw it before the fall, an organic unity, a harmony of opposites, a melody of positive and negative, delight with the play of our vibratory existence. When the opposites are realized to be one, discord melts into concord, battles become dances, and old enemies become lovers. We are then in a position to make friends with all of our universe, not just one half of it. Chapter 3: No Boundary Territory. The ultimate metaphysical secret, if we dare state it so simply, is that there are no boundaries in the universe. Boundaries are illusions, products not of reality, but of the way we map and edit reality. And while it is fine to map out the territory, it's fatal to confuse the two. It's not just that there are no boundaries between the opposites. In a much wider sense, there are no dividing boundaries between any things or events anywhere in the cosmos. And nowhere is the reality of no boundary seen more clearly than in modern physics, which is all the more remarkable considering that classic physics, associated with names such as Kepler, Galileo, and Newton, was one of the true heirs of Adam, the mapmaker and boundary drawer. When Adam passed on, he left humankind his legacy of mapmaking and boundary drawing. And since every boundary carries with it political and technological power, Adam's bounding, classifying, and naming of nature marked the first beginnings of technological power and control over nature. As a matter of fact, Hebrew tradition has it that the fruit of the tree of knowledge actually harbored knowledge not of good and evil, but of the useful and the useless, that is, technological knowledge. But if every boundary carried technological and political power, it also carries alienation, fragmentation, and conflict. Because when you establish a boundary so as to gain control over something, at the same time you separate and alienate yourself from that which you attempt to control. Hence the fall of Adam into fragmentation, known as original sin. Yet the boundaries Adam drew were very simple kinds of boundaries. They were merely classified and were useful only in description, definition, and naming, and so on. And Adam didn't even make full use of the classifying boundaries. He had hardly gotten around to naming vegetables and fruits when he fumbled the ball and got kicked out of the game. Generations later, the descendants of Adam finally worked up enough nerve to start fooling around with the boundaries again, and more subtle and abstract boundaries at that. In Greece, men of brilliant intellectual powers appeared, that is, great map-makers and boundary drawers. Aristotle, for instance, classified nearly every process and thing in nature with such precision and persuasion that it would take centuries for Europeans just to question the validity of his boundaries. But no matter how precise and complex your classifications, you can't do very much, scientifically at least, with that type of boundary line except describe and define. You have only a qualitative science, a classifying science. However, once you have laid down your initial boundaries, so that the world appears as a complex of separate things and events, you can then proceed to much more subtle and abstract types of boundaries, and the Greeks, like Pythagoras, did just that. For what Pythagoras discovered, looking all over the various classes of things and events, from horses to oranges to stars, was that he could perform a brilliant trick with all these different objects. He could, in fact, count them. If naming seems magic, counting seemed divine, because while names could magically represent things, numbers could transcend them. For instance, 1 orange plus 1 orange equals 2 oranges, but so does 1 apple plus 1 apple equal 2 apples. The number 2 refers impartially to any and all groups of 2 things, so somehow must transcend them. Through abstract numbers, humans succeeded in freeing their minds from concrete things. To some extent, this was possible through the first type of boundary, through naming, classifying, and noting differences. But numbers increased this power dramatically, for in a sense, counting was actually a totally new type of boundary. It was a boundary on a boundary, a meta-boundary, and it worked like this. With the first type of boundary, we draw a dividing line between different things and then recognize them as constituting a group or class, which we then name frogs, cheeses, mountains, or whatnot. This is the first or basic type of boundary. Once we have drawn our first boundaries, we can then draw a second type of boundary on the first type and then count the things in our classes. If the first boundary gives a class of things, the second boundary gives a class of things. So, for example, the number 7 refers equally to all groups or classes of things which have 7 members. 7 can refer to 7 grapes, 7 days, 7 dwarfs, and so on. The number 7, in other words, is a group of all the groups that have 7 members. It is therefore a class of classes, a boundary of a boundary. A boundary on a boundary. Thus, with numbers, humans construct a new type of boundary, a more abstract and generalized boundary, a meta-boundary. And since boundaries carry political and technological power, humans have thereby increased their ability to control the natural world. However, these new and more powerful boundaries brought with them the potential not only for more developed technology, but also a more pervasive alienation and fragmentation. The Greeks succeeded in introducing, through this new meta-boundary of number, a subtle conflict, a subtle dualism which has fastened onto Europeans as a vampire battens on its prey. For abstract numbers, this new meta-boundary so transcended the concrete world that humans discovered that they were now living in 2 worlds, the concrete versus the abstract, the ideal versus the real, the universal versus the particular. Over the next 2,000 years, this dualism would change its form a dozen times, but rarely be uprooted or harmonized. It became a battle of the rational versus the aromantic, ideal versus experience, intellect versus instinct, law versus chaos, mind versus matter. Those distinctions were all based on appropriate and real lines, but the lines usually degenerated into boundaries and battles. This new meta-boundary, that of number, counting, measuring, and the like, was not really put to use by natural scientists for centuries until the time of Galilei and Kepler, around the year 1600. For the intervening period between the Greeks and the first classical physicists was occupied by a new force on the European scene, the Church. And the Church would have none of that measuring or scientifically numbering up of the nature. The Church, through the influence of Thomas Aquinas, was closely allied with the logic of Aristotle, and Aristotle's logic, for all its brilliance, was predominantly one of classifying. Aristotle was a biologist, and carrying on the classifying begun by Adam, he never really got into the full swing of the Pythagorean number and measurement, and neither did the Church. By the 17th century, the Church was in decline, and humans began looking carefully at all forms and processes of the natural world. It was at this time that the genius of Galileo and Kepler entered the drama. The revolutionary thing these physicians accomplished was simply to measure, and measurement is just a sophisticated form of counting. So where Adam and Aristotle drew boundaries, Kepler and Galileo drew meta-boundaries. But the 17th century scientists didn't just resurrect the meta-boundary of number and measurement and then sophisticate it. They went one step further and introduced, or rather perfected, an entirely new boundary of their own. Incredible as it seems, they came up with a boundary on the meta-boundary. They invented the meta-meta-boundary, better known as algebra. Put simply, the first boundary produces a class. The meta-boundary produces a class of classes called number. The third, or meta-meta, boundary produces a class of classes called variable. The variable is best known as that which is represented in the formulas x, y, or z, and the variable works like this. Just as a number can represent anything, a variable can represent any number. Just as 5 can refer to any 5 things, x can refer to any number over a given range. By using algebra, the early scientists could proceed not only to number and measure the elements, but also to search out abstract relations between those measurements, which would be expressed in theories, laws, and principles. And these laws seemed, in some sense, to govern or control all things and events marked off with the very first type of boundaries. The early scientists produced laws by the dozens. Quote, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Quote, force is equal to the mass times the acceleration of the enforced body. Quote, the amount of work done on a body equals the force times the distance. This new type of boundary, the meta-meta boundary, brought new knowledge and, of course, explosive new technological and political power. Europe was rocketed with an intellectual revolution the likes of which humankind had never seen. Just imagine. Adam could name the planets, Pythagoras could count them, but Newton could tell you how much they weighed. Notice, then, this entire process of formulating scientific laws was based on 3 general types of boundaries, each building on its predecessor and each being more abstract and generalized. First, you draw a classifying boundary so as to recognize different things and events. Second, you search among your classified elements for ones that can be measured. This meta-boundary allows you to shift quality to quantity, classes to classes of classes, elements to measurements. Third, you search for relationships between your numbers and measurements of the second step until you can invent an algebraic formula embracing them all. This meta-meta boundary converts measurements to conclusions, numbers to principles. Each step, each new boundary, brings you a more generalized knowledge and hence more power. This knowledge, power, and control over nature was, however, brought at a price, for as always, a boundary is a double-edged sword, and the fruits it slices from nature are necessarily bittersweet. Man has gained control over nature, but only by radically separating himself from it. In the mere span of 10 generations, he had for the first time in history awarded himself the dubious honor of being able to blast the entire planet, himself included, to smithereens. The earth's heavens were so choked with fumes that birds were abandoning existence, the lakes so clogged with greasy sludge that some of them would spontaneously catch fire, the ocean so dense with insoluble chemical jello that fish were buoyed onto the surface like styrofoam on mercury, and the rains that fell to the earth in some places would corrode sheet metal. And yet, during the span of 10 generations, a second revolution in science was forming. Nobody guessed or could have guessed that this revolution, when it finally accumulated around 1925, would signal the surpassing of classical physics. Its boundaries, meta-boundaries, and meta-meta-boundaries. The whole world of classical boundaries shattered and fell before the likes of Einstein, Schrödinger, Eddington, de Broglie, Broher, and Heisenberg. As you read the accounts of this 20th century revolution in science given by these physics themselves, physicists themselves, you can't help being struck by the awesome nature of the intellectual upheaval that occurred in the brief span of a single generation, 1905 to 1925, dating from Einstein's relativity theory to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The classical boundaries and maps of the old physics literally fell apart. In 1925, Whitehead stated, quote, "The progress of science has now reached a turning point. The fundamental foundations of physics have broken up. The old foundations of scientific thought are becoming unintelligible. Time, space, matter, material, ether, electricity, mechanism, organism, configuration, structure, pattern, function, all require reinterpretation. What is the sense of talking about mechanical explanation when you do not know what is meant by mechanics?" Unquote. And Louis de Broglie said, quote, "On the day when quanta surreptitiously were introduced to the vast and grandiose edifice of classical physics, found itself shaken in its very foundations. In the history of the intellectual world, there have been few upheavals comparable to this." Unquote. To understand why this quantum revolution was such a cataclysmic upheaval, remember that by the dawn of the 20th century, the world of science had enjoyed about 14 decades of astonishing success. The universe was viewed, at least through the eyes of the classical physicists, as a magnificent but inarticulate collection of separate things and events, each perfectly isolated by definite boundaries in space and time. Further, these separate entities, planets, rocks, meteors, apples, and people, were thought of capable of being precisely measured and numbered, a process which in turn eventually yields scientific laws and principles. So successful was this procedure that scientists began dreaming that all of nature was governed by these laws. This world was viewed as a giant Newtonian billiard table where all the separate things in the universe acted like billiard balls, blindly smashing around and occasionally colliding with each other. As scientists began exploring the world of subatomic physics, they naturally assumed that all the old Newtonian laws, or something like them, would apply to the to the protons, neutrons, and electrons. But they didn't. Not at all, not even a little. The shock was comparable to pulling off your glove one day and finding a lobster claw where you expected your hand. Worse yet, it wasn't just that these ultimate realities, like the electrons, didn't fit the old physical laws. These ultimate realities couldn't even be located. As Heisenberg put it, quote, "We can no longer consider in themselves those building stones of matter which we originally held to be the last real objective reality. This is so because they defy all forms of objective location in space and time." Unquote. Not only did the subatomic billiard balls not obey established laws, the billiard balls themselves didn't even exist, at least not as separate entities. The atom, in other words, wasn't behaving like a discrete thing. The old physics had metamorphically viewed the atom as a miniature solar system with neutrons and protons composing the sun molecules, composing the sun nucleus, and discrete planetary electrons spinning around it. But now the atom began to look more like a nebulous cloud that infinitely shaded into its environment. As Henry Stamp put it, quote, "An elementary particle is not an independently existing, unanalyzable entity. It is, in essence, a set of relationships that reach outwards to other things." Unquote. These atomic things, the ultimate building blocks of all reality, couldn't be located because, in short, they had no boundaries. Moreover, because these ultimate realities of the universe had no definite boundaries, they couldn't be adequately measured. This was extremely disconcerting to the physicists, because their stock in trade was the ruler of scientific measurement, numbering, and meta-boundaries. The fact that these basic realities could never be totally measured under any circumstances was called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and it capped the final end of classical physics. Heisenberg himself called it the dissolution of the rigid frame. The old boundaries had collapsed. Because the subatomic particles possessed no boundaries, there could be no meta-boundaries, no measurements, and hence also no precise meta-meta-boundaries, no laws. To this day, there is no law, no meta-meta-map governing the movements of a single electron, because a single electron doesn't have a boundary in the first place. You can't have a meta-boundary or a meta-meta-boundary if there isn't even a boundary to begin with. Nuclear physicists must now look with probabilities and statistics. This means that they must gather together for their measurements enough atomic elements that the physicists can pretend that the collected group looks like a distinct thing with a make-believe boundary. Then they can construct meta-boundaries and offer up an educated guess as to how the system as a whole might behave. But the crucial item is that the physicists now know that these boundaries are pretend and make-believe, and that the basic constituents themselves remain no boundary. It is now easier to see what went wrong with all the old physics. It had been so enraptured with the success of its meta-boundaries and meta-meta-boundaries that it had totally forgot the conventional nature of the original boundaries themselves. The meta-boundaries and the meta-meta-boundaries were so useful and carried such political and technological power that it never dawned on the classical physicists that their original boundaries might be false. To put it another way, they developed laws governing separate things only to discover that the separate things don't exist. The new quantum physicists were forced to recognize the conventional nature of the original boundaries themselves, and for the simple reason that they couldn't find the real ones. Boundaries, instead of being a product of reality, there for all to feel and touch and measure, were finally seen as a product of the way we map and edit reality. Said the physicist Eddington, quote, "We have found that where science has progressed the furthest, the mind has but regained from nature that which the mind has put into nature. We have found a strange footprint on the shores of the unknown. We have devised profound theories, one after the other, to account for its origin. At last we have succeeded in reconstructing the creature that made the footprint, and lo, it is our own." Unquote. This is not to say that the real world is a mere product of our imagination, subjective idealism, only that our boundaries are. This is why Wittgenstein said, quote, "At the basis of the whole modern view of the world lies the illusion that the so-called laws of nature are the explanation of natural phenomena." Unquote. For these laws describe not reality, but only our boundaries of reality. As Wittgenstein put it, quote, "Laws like the law of causation, etc., treat of the network of boundaries, and are not of what the network describes." Unquote. In short, the quantum physicists discovered that reality could no longer be viewed as a complex of distinct things and boundaries. Rather, what were once thought to be bounded things turned out to be interwoven aspects of each other. For some strange reason, everything and event in the universe seemed to be interconnected with every other thing and event in the universe. The world, the real territory, began to look not like a collection of billiard balls, but more like a single giant universal field, which Whitehead called the seamless coat of the universe. These physicists, it seems, succeeded in catching a glimpse of the real world, the territory of no boundary, the world Adam saw before he drew his fatal boundaries, the world as it is and not as it is classified, bounded, mapped, metamapped. Teilhard de Chardin speaks of this seamless quote. Quote, "Considered in its concrete reality, the stuff of the universe cannot divide itself, but, as a kind of gigantic atom, it forms in its totality the only real indivisible. The further and more deeply we penetrate into matter by means of increasingly powerful methods, the more we are confounded by the interdependence of its parts. It is impossible to cut into this network, to isolate a portion without becoming frayed and unraveled at its edges." End quote. Interesting enough, this concept of modern physics, that the world is in some ways similar to a giant atom, is, as far as it goes, and really is only scratching the surface, the Buddhist doctrine of the Dharmadutta, which means ultimate realm or field of reality. The major principle of the Dharmadutta is called Shi-Wa-I. Shi means thing, event, entity, phenomenon, object, process. Su means no, and I means obstruction, block, boundary, separation. I. This translates as boundary, as between everything and event in the universe, there is no boundary. Because there are no real dividing boundaries between things, every entity in the world is said to interpenetrate every other entity in the world. As Garamachang explains, and then we quote, in the infinite Dharmahatu, each and everything simultaneously includes all other things in perfect completion, without the slightest deficiency or omission, at all times. To see one object, therefore, is to see all objects, and vice versa. This is to say, a tiny individual particle within the minute cosmos of an atom actually contains the infinite objects and principles in the infinite universe of the future, and of the remote past of the perfect completeness, without omission. End of quote. In Mahayana Buddhism, the universe is therefore likened to a vast net of jewels, wherein the reflection from one jewel is contained in all jewels, and the reflection of all is contained in each. As the Buddhists put it, all in one and one in all. This sounds very mystical and far out until you hear a modern physicist explain the present-day view of elementary particles. Quote, this states in ordinary language that each particle consists of all other particles, each of which is in the same way, at the same time, all the other particles together. Unquote. Similarities such as these have prompted many scientists to agree with the physicist Fritjof Capra. Quote, the two basic theories of modern physics thus exhibit all the main features of the Eastern world view. Quantum theory has abolished the notion of fundamentally separated objects, has introduced the concept of the participator to replace that of the observer, and has come to see the universe as an interconnected web of relations, whose parts are only defined through the interconnections of the whole. Unquote. In essence, the great similarity is that both modern science and Eastern philosophy view reality not as boundaries and separate things, but as non-dual network of inseparable patterns, a giant atom, a seamless coat of no boundary. The reason the East knew this long before the Western sciences stumbled on it is that the East never took boundaries seriously. Boundaries didn't so go to their heads that their heads and nature parted ways. For the East, there was only one way, the Tao, the Dharma, and it signaled a wholeness under the dividing boundaries of man-made maps. The East, in seeing that reality was non-dual, not two, saw all boundaries were illusory. Thus, they really never fell into the fallacy of confusing the map with the territory, boundaries with reality, symbols with actuality, names with what is named. Open any good Buddhist sutra, most of which was written centuries ago, and you might read something like this, quote, by appearance is meant that which reveals itself to the senses and to the discriminating mind, and is perceived as form, sound, odor, taste, and touch. Out of these appearances, ideas are formed, such as clay, water, jar, etc., by which one says, this is such a thing, and is no other. This is name. When appearances are contrasted and names compared, as when we say, this is an elephant, and this is a horse, a cart, a pedestrian, a man, a woman, or this is mind and what belongs to it, things thus named are said to be discriminated. As these discriminations, i.e. boundaries, come to be seen as empty and of self-substance, this is right knowledge. By it, the wise cease to regard appearances and names as reality. When appearances and names are put away and all discrimination ceases, that which remains is the true and essential nature of things, and, as nothing can be predicated as to the nature of essence, it is called the suchness of reality. This universal, undifferentiated, inscrutable suchness is the only reality. End quote. Lankavatara Sutra. From another angle, this is the profound Buddhist doctrine of the void, which maintains that reality is void of thoughts and void of things. It is void of things because, as our physicists discovered, things are simply abstract boundaries of experience. And it is void of thought because thought, or symbolic map-making, is precisely the process which superimposes boundaries on reality. To see a thing is to think. To think is to picture things to yourself. Thinking and thinging are thus two different names for the net of boundaries we toss over reality. Hence, when Buddhists say reality is void, they mean it is void of boundaries. They do not mean that all entities simply up and vanish, leaving behind a pure vacuum of nothingness, an undifferentiated monastic mush. Speaking of the void, D.T. Suzuki says that it, quote, does not deny the world multiplicities. Mountains are there, the cherries are in full bloom, the moon shines most brightly in the autumnal night. But at the same time, they are more than particularities. They appeal to us with deeper meaning. They are understood in relation to what they are not. End quote. The point is that when the world is seen to be void of boundaries, then all things and events, just like all the opposites, are seen to be mutually dependent and interpenetrating. Just as pleasure is related to pain, good to evil, and life to death, so all things are related to what they are not. This is difficult for most of us to grasp, for we are still very much under the spell of Adam's original sin, and so we cling to boundaries as to life itself. But the essence of the insight that reality is no boundary is very simple. Its simplicity is what makes it so difficult to see. Take, for example, your own field of vision. He says your own visual field. As your eye scans the territory of nature, does it ever see a single thing, a solitary thing, a separate thing? Has it ever seen a tree, a wave, a bird? Or does it instead see a kaleidoscopic flux of all sorts of interwoven patterns and textures of tree plus sky plus grass plus ground, of waves plus sand plus rocks plus sky plus clouds? Even as you now read the lines of the print in this book, if you carefully notice your entire visual field, you will see that your eye isn't taking in just one word at a time. Your eye sees, although it can't actually read, all the words on this page, plus some of the surrounding background, perhaps your hands and lower arm, your lap, a table, parts of the room, and so on. In your immediate and concrete awareness, therefore, there is no separate thing, no boundaries. You never actually see a single entity, but always a richly textured field. This is the nature of your immediate reality, and it is completely void of boundaries. But you can mentally superimpose pretend boundaries upon your immediate field of awareness. You can bound off a section of the field by focusing attention on just a few prominent areas, such as a tree, a wave, a bird, and then pretend to be aware of just that particular object by deliberately excluding the rest of the field of awareness. You can, that is, concentrate, which means to introduce a boundary to awareness. You can focus on just these words and pretend not to notice all other sights in your conscious field. This is an extremely useful and certainly necessary trick, but it is apt to backfire. The fact that you can concentrate and thus attend to one separate thing at a time is liable to make it appear that reality itself is composed of a bunch of these separate things, while in actuality all these separate things are merely a byproduct of your own superimposed boundaries on the field of your awareness. If the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything starts to look like a nail. But the fact is that you never really see boundaries and you only manufacture them. You do not perceive separate things, you invent them. The problem being as soon as these inventions are mistaken for reality itself, then the actual world appears as if it were a fragmented and disjointed affair, and a primal mood of alienation invades awareness itself. So when the Eastern sage says that all things are void, or all things are not true, or all things are interpenetrating, she does not mean to deny differences, to overlook individuality, to see the world as homogeneous gunk. The world contains all types of features and surfaces and lines, but they are all interwoven into a seamless field. Look at it this way. Your hand is surely different from your head, and your head is different from your feet, and your feet are different from your ears. But we have no difficulty at all in recognizing that all members of one body, and likewise your one body expresses itself with all its various parts, all in one and one in all. Similarly, in the territory of no boundary, all things and events are equally members of one body, the Dhammakaya, the mystic body of Christ, the universal field of Brahma, the organic pattern of the Tao. Any physicist will tell you that all objects in the cosmos are simply various forms of single energy, and whether we call the energy Brahma, Tao, God, or just plain energy seems to me quite beside the point. What we have seen in the last two chapters, or at least according to some of the recent developments in modern science and the ancient wisdom of the East, is that reality is no boundary. Any conceivable sort of boundary is a mere abstraction from the seamless coat of the universe, and hence all boundaries are pure illusions, in the sense that they create separation and ultimately conflict, where there is none. The boundaries between opposites, as well as the boundaries between things and events, remain at last deceptions in depth. For the East, the reality of no boundary has never been just a theoretical or philosophical concern, however. It was never something to be worked out on a blackboard or in a lab, important as these pursuits are. Rather, no boundary was a matter of everyday, concrete living. For people are always trying to bound their lives, their experiences, and their realities. And alas, every boundary line is a potential battle line. Thus, the sole aim for the East and esoteric Western, for the Eastern and esoteric Western ways of liberation is to deliver people from the conflicts and complexities of their battles by delivering them from their boundaries. They do not try to solve the battle in its own terms, for it is impossible as washing off blood with blood. Instead, they simply demonstrate the illusory nature of the boundaries which create the battles. Thus the battle is not solved, but dissolved. To disclose reality as no boundary is thus to disclose all conflicts as illusory. And this final understanding is called nirvana, moksha, release, liberation, enlightenment, and satori. Freedom from the pairs, freedom from the enchanting vision of separateness, freed from the chain of one's illusory boundary. And with this understanding, we are now ready to examine this no-boundary awareness, commonly called unity consciousness. Chapter 4, No-Boundary Awareness. Unity consciousness is a simple awareness of the real territory of no boundary. We need no gimmicks to explain it, no mumbo-jumbo, no mystic jargon, no miasma of occultism. If reality is actually a condition of boundary, and to deny what we will have to turn our we will have to turn our backs on relativity theory, ecological sciences, and the philosophy of organisms and the wisdom of the East. If reality is a condition of no boundary, then unity consciousness is the natural state of awareness which acknowledges this reality. Unity consciousness, in short, is no boundary awareness. As simple as that sounds, it is nevertheless extremely difficult to adequately discuss no-boundary awareness or non-dual consciousness. This is because our language, the medium in which all verbal discussion must float, is a language of boundaries. As we have seen, words and symbols and thoughts themselves are actually nothing but boundaries, for whenever you think or use a word or name, you are already creating boundaries. Even to say reality is no-boundary awareness is still to create a distinction between boundaries and no boundaries. So we have to keep in mind the great difficulty involved with dualistic language. That reality is no boundary is true enough, provided we remember that no boundary awareness is a direct, immediate, and nonverbal awareness, and not a mere philosophical theory. It is for these reasons that the mystic sages stress that reality lies beyond names and forms, words and thoughts, divisions and boundaries. Beyond all boundaries lies the world of suchness, the void, the Dharmakaya, Tao, Brahman, the Godhead. And in the world of suchness, there is neither good nor bad, saint nor sinner, birth nor death. For in the world of suchness, there are no boundaries. And especially there is no boundary between subject and object, self and self and not self, seer and seen. I emphasize that point and will dwell on it throughout this chapter, because all the boundaries we construct, the one between self and not self is the most fundamental. It is the boundary we are most reluctant to surrender. It was, after all, the first boundary we ever drew. It is our most cherished boundary. We have invested years to fortify and defend it, make it secure and safe. It is the very boundary that establishes our sense of being a separate self. As we grow old, full of years and memories, and begin to slip into the nothingness of death, this is the last boundary we relinquish. The boundary between self and not self is the first one we draw and the last one we erase. Of all the boundaries we construct, this is the one primary boundary. So fundamental is the primary boundary between self and not-self that all our other boundaries depend upon it. We can hardly distinguish boundaries between things until we have distinguished ourselves from things. Every boundary you create depends on your separate existence, that is, your primary boundary of self versus not-self. To be sure, any and all boundaries are obstacles to unity consciousness, but since all of our other boundaries depend upon this primary boundary, to see through it is to see through all. In a sense, this is most fortunate, for if we had to tackle all of our boundaries separately, one by one, it would take a lifetime, perhaps several, to dissolve them all and gain liberation from the pairs. But by aiming at the primary boundary, our work is enormously simplified. It is as if our various boundaries constituted an inverted pyramid of blocks, all of which are resting on one block at the tip. Pull out that block and the whole edifice collapses. We can look at this primary boundary from many angles and under many names. It is that irreducible separation between what I call myself and what I call not self, me in here and objects out there. It is the split between knowledge subject and known object. It is that space between my organism and the environment. It is the gap between the I, which is now reading the page, and the page which is being read. All in all, it is the gap between the experiencer and the world which is experienced. It thus appears that on the inside of the primary boundary there exists myself, the subject, the thinker, the feeler, the seer, and on the other side there exists the not-self, the world of objects out there, the environment foreign and separate from me. In unity consciousness, in no boundary awareness, the sense of self expands to totally include everything once thought to be not self. One sense of identity shifts to the entire universe, to all worlds, high or low, manifest or unmanifest, sacred or profane. And obviously this cannot occur as long as the primary boundary, which separates the self from the universe, is mistaken as real. And once the primary boundary is understood to be illusory, one's sense of self envelops the all. There is then no longer anything outside of oneself and nowhere to draw any sort of boundary. Thus, if we can at all begin to see through the primary boundary, the sense of unity consciousness will not be far behind us. Not be far from us. Not behind. From the foregoing, it's too easy to jump to the erroneous conclusion that all we have to do to usher in unity consciousness is destroy the primary boundary. In a crude sense, this may be true, but the situation is actually much, much simpler than that. We really don't have to go to the trouble of trying to destroy the primary boundary, and for an extremely simple reason, the primary boundary doesn't exist. Like all boundaries, it is only an illusion. It only seems to exist. We pretend it exists, we assume it exists, we behave in every way as if it exists, but it does not. And if we go now in search of the primary boundary, we will find not a trace of it, for ghosts leave no shadows. Right now, and I mean right when you're reading this, there is no real primary boundary, and so right now there is no real barrier to unity consciousness. Thus, we will not search out the primary boundary and then try to destroy it. That, in fact, would be a grave error, or at least a colossal waste of time, for we cannot destroy what doesn't exist in the first place. Trying to destroy the primary boundary is like standing in the midst of a mirage and batting one's arms furiously in an attempt to dispel it. Despite the intense excitement such activity may generate, it remains a totally futile affair. You cannot eradicate an illusion, you can only understand and see through the illusion itself. From this point of view, even trying to destroy the primary boundary through such elaborate activities as yoga, mental concentration, prayer, ritual, chanting, fasting, all of that merely assumes the primary boundary to be real and thereby enforces and perpetuates the very illusion it seeks to destroy. As Fenelon, Archbishop of Cambria, put it, quote, "There are no more dangerous illusions than the fancies by which people try to avoid illusion." Unquote. Instead of assuming the primary boundary to be real and then taking steps to eliminate it, we will go first in search of the primary boundary itself. And if it indeed is an illusion, we will never find a trace of it. We might then spontaneously understand that which we thought obstructed our unity consciousness never existed in the first place. And as we shall see, that insight itself is already a glimpse of no-boundary awareness. Now, what exactly does it mean to look for a primary boundary? To look for the primary boundary is to look very carefully for the sensation of being a separate self, a separate experiencer and feeler, which is set apart from experiences and feelings. I am suggesting that if we carefully look for this self, we won't find it. And since this feeling of being an isolated self seems to be the major obstacle in unity consciousness, to look for it and not find it is, at the same time, to glimpse unity consciousness itself. Listen to the great Buddhist sage Padmasambhava, quote, "And the seeker himself, when sought, cannot be found. If the seeker himself, when sought, cannot be found, thereupon is attained the goal of seeking and also the end of the search itself." Unquote. At the outset of such an experiment, we must be very clear about just what this absence of self or absence of primary boundary means. It does not mean a loss of all sensibilities, and it's not a state of trance, chaos, turmoil, or uncontrolled behavior. It is not that my mind and body explode into vapor and merge into one large lump of some sort of something somewhere. It is not to do with schizophrenic regression, which does not transcend the self, not self-boundary at all, but instead muddles and confuses it. Rather, when we speak of loss of self, we mean this. The sensation of being a separate self is a sensation that has been misunderstood and misinterpreted, and it is the dispelling of these misinterpretations that concern us. We all have that sensation, that core feeling of being an isolated self split from our stream of experience and split from the world around us. We all have that feeling of self on the one hand and a feeling of external world on the other. But if we carefully look at the sensation of self in here and the sensation of world out there, we will find that these two sensations are actually one and the same feeling. In other words, what I now feel to be the objective world out there is the same thing I feel as the subjective world in here. The split between the experiencer and the world of experiences does not exist, and therefore cannot be found. Initially, this sounds very strange because we are so used to believing it in boundaries. But it seems so obvious that I am the hearer who hears sounds, and I am the feeler who feels feelings, and I am the seer who sees sights. But on the other hand, isn't it odd that I should describe myself as a seer who sees the things seen, or the hearer who hears the sounds heard? Is perception really that complicated? Does it really involve three separate entities, a seer, seeing, and a seen? Surely there aren't three separate entities here. Is there ever such a thing as a seer without seeing or without something seen? Is there ever seeing without a seer or without something seen? The fact is, the seer, seeing, and the seen are all aspects of one process. Never at any time is one of them found without the other. Our problem is that we have three words: seer, sees, and seen, for one single activity, the experience of seeing. We might as well describe a single water stream as the streamer streams the stream. It is utterly redundant and introduces three factors where there is, in fact, but one. Yet, hypnotized as we are by Adam's word magic, we assume that there must be a separate entity, the seer, and that through some sort of process called seeing, the seer gains knowledge of yet another thing called seeing. We then naturally assume that we are just a seer, which is totally divorced from the seen. Our world, which is only given once, is thereby split right down the middle, with the seer in here confronting across the gaping abyss of seeing the things seen out there. Let us instead go back to the very beginning of the process of the experience itself and see if the experiencer is really all that different from the experienced. Begin with a sense of hearing. Close your eyes and attend to the actual process of hearing. Notice all the odd sounds floating around: birds singing, cars rumbling, crickets chirping, kids laughing, TV blaring. But with all these sounds, notice that there is one thing which you cannot hear, no matter how carefully you attend to every sound. You cannot hear the hearer. That is, in addition to those sounds, you cannot hear a hearer of the sounds. You cannot hear a hearer because there isn't one. What you have been taught to call a hearer is actually just the experience of hearing itself. And you don't hear hearing. In reality, there is just a stream of sounds, and that stream is not split into a subject and an object. There is no boundary here. If you let the sensation of being a hearer inside the skull dissolve into hearing itself, you might find yourself merging with the entire world of outside sounds, quote-unquote outside sounds. As one Zen master explained upon his enlightenment, quote, "When I heard the temple bell ring, suddenly there was no bell and no I, just the ringing," unquote. It was through such an experiment that Avalokiteshvara is said to have gained his enlightenment, for in giving awareness to the process of hearing, he realized that there was no separate self, no hearer, apart from the stream of hearing itself. When you try to hear the subjective hearer, all you find are objective sounds, and this means that you do not hear sounds, you are the sounds. The hearer is every sound which is heard. It is not a separate entity which stands back and hears hearing. The same is true of the process of seeing. If I look carefully at the visual field, it seems almost to hang in space, suspended in nothingness. Yet it consists of an infinitely rich pattern of interlaced lights, colors, and shades, forming themselves in a mountain here, a cloud there, a stream below. But of all the sights I can see, there is still one thing which I cannot see, no matter how the eye strains. I cannot see the seer of the visual field. The more I try to see the seer, the more its absence begins to puzzle me. For years it seemed perfectly natural to assume that I was the seer which saw the sights. But the moment I go in search of the seer, I find no trace of it. In fact, if I persist in trying to see the seer, all I find are things which are seen. This simply means that I, the seer, do not see sights, rather I, the seer, am identical to all those sights now present. The so-called seer is nothing other than everything which is seen. If I look at a tree, there is not one experience called tree and another experience called seeing the tree. This is just the single experience of seeing the tree. I do not see the seeing any more than I smell smelling or taste tasting. It seems that whatever we look at for a self apart from experience, it vanishes into experience. When we look for the experiencer, we find only another experience. The subject and objects always turn out to be one. Because this is a rather unnerving experience, you might now be feeling somewhat confused as you sit thinking this all over. But push onward just a bit. As you are now thinking about this, can you also find a thinker who is thinking about this? That is there a thinker who thinks the thought, "I'm confused," or is it just the thought, "I'm confused"? Surely there is just the present thought, because if there were also a thinker of the thought, would you then think about the thinker who is thinking about the thought? It seems obvious that what we mistakenly believe to be the thinker is really nothing other than the stream of present thoughts. Thus, when the present thought was, "I'm confused," you were not at the same time aware of a thinker was thinking, "I'm confused." This was just the present thought alone, "I'm confused." When you then looked for the thinker of that thought, you found that there was another present thought, namely, "I'm thinking I'm confused." Never did you find a thinker apart from the present thought, which is only to say that the two are identical. This is precisely why the sage advises us not to try to destroy the self, but simply look for it, because wherever we look for it, we will find its prior absence. But even if we have begun to understand that there is no separate hearer, no taster, no seer, no thinker, we are still likely to find within ourselves a type of irreducible core feeling of being a separate and isolated self. There is still that sensation of being separate from the world out there. There is still the gut feeling that I somehow know my inner self. Even if I can't see, taste, or hear myself, I definitely feel myself. Well, you can find, in addition to the feeling you are now calling yourself, a feeler who is doing, can you find, in addition to the feeling you are now calling yourself, a feeler who is doing the feeling? And if it seems you can you then find the feeler who is doing the feeling? Again, that core sensation of being a feeler who has feelings is itself just another feeling. The feeler is nothing but a present feeling, just as the thinker is just a present thought, and the taster is just a present taste. In this case, too, there is no separate feeler different from the present feeling, and there never was. Thus, the inescapable conclusion starts to draw on us. There is no separate self set apart from the world. You have always assumed you were a separate experiencer, but the moment you actually go in search of it, it vanishes into experience. As Alan Watts puts it, quote, "There is simply experience. There is not something or someone experiencing experience. You do not feel, feeling, think thoughts, or sense sensations any more than you hear, hearing, see, sight, or smell, smelling. I feel fine means that a fine feeling is present. It does not mean that there is one thing called I and another thing called feeling, so that when you bring them together, I feels the fine feelings. There are no feelings but present feelings, and whatever feeling is present is I. No one ever found an I apart from some present experience, or some experience apart from an I, which is to say that the two are the same thing." Unquote. Now, when you understand that there is no gap between you and your experiences, doesn't it start to become obvious that there is no gap between you and the world which is experienced? If you are your experiences, you are the world so experienced. You do not have a sensation of a bird, you are the sensation of the bird. You don't have an experience of a table, you are the experience of the table. You do not hear the sound of thunder, you are the sound of thunder. The inner sensation called you and the outer sensation called the world are one and the same sensation. The inner subject and the outer subject are two names for one feeling. This is not something you should feel. It is the only thing you can feel. This means that your state of consciousness right now is, whether you realize it or not, unity consciousness. Right now you are already the cosmos. You are already the totality of your present experience. Your present state is always unitary consciousness because the separate self, which seems to be the major obstacle to unity consciousness, is always an illusion. You needn't try to destroy the separate self because it isn't there in the first place. All you really have to do is to look for it, and you won't find it. That very not finding is itself an acknowledgement of unity consciousness. In other words, whenever you look for yourself and don't find it, you momentarily fall into your prior and real state of unity consciousness. As odd as all of this might initially sound, the insight that there is no separate self has been obvious to the mystics and sages of all times, and forms one of the core points of the perennial philosophy. Although there are numerous quotations that could illuminate this insight, the celebrated summary of the Buddhist teachings really says it all. Quote, "Suffering alone exists, none who suffer. The deed there is, but no doer thereof. Nirvana is, but no one seeking it. The path there is, but none who travel it." End of quote. And this is just that understanding which is universally said to constitute liberation from all suffering. Stated positively, when it is realized that oneself is the all, then there is nothing outside of oneself which could inflict suffering. There is nothing outside the universe against which it might crash. Stated negatively, this understanding is a liberation from all suffering because it is a liberation from the notion that there is a self which can suffer in the first place. As Wai Wu Wai put it, "Why are you unhappy? Because 99.9% of everything you think and of everything you do is for yourself, and there isn't one." Unquote. Only parts suffer, not the whole. And this realization, when stated negatively by the mystic, says, quote, "You are released from suffering when you realize the part is an illusion. There is no separate self to suffer." Unquote. When stated positively, it says, "You are always the whole, which knows only freedom, release, and radiance. To realize the whole is to escape the fate of a part, which is only suffering, pain, and death." End quote. Hinayana Buddhism stresses the former, Hinduism, Christianity the latter, and Mahayana Buddhism seems to strike a happy balance. Yet they are all witness to the same insight. When we realize there is no part, we fall into the whole. When we realize there is always no self, and this is happening right now, we realize our own true identity. Our true identity is always the supreme identity. In the ever-present light of no boundary awareness, What we once imagined to be an isolated self in here turns out to be all of a piece with the cosmos out there, and this, if anything, is your real self. Wherever you look, you behold your original face on all its sides. I came back into the hall, as one Zen master explained in his first glimpse of no boundary, and was about to go to my seat when the whole outlook changed. I looked around and up and down, and the whole universe, with its multitudinous sense objects, now appeared quite different. What was loathsome before, together with ignorance and passions, was now seemed to be nothing else but the flow of my own innermost nature, which in itself remained bright, true, transparent. As Tattvam Asi, the Hindus say, you are that. Your real self is identical to the ultimate energy, of which all things in the universe are a manifestation. This real self has been given dozens of different names by the various mystical and metaphysical traditions throughout human history. It had been known as Al-Insam Al-Kamil. It has been known as the Al-Insam Al-Kamir, Adam, Kadmon, Ruach Adoni, Nous, Pnoma, Purashu, Tatha Garbara, universal person, the host, the Brahman Atman, the I amness, and from a slightly different angle, it is actually synonymous with the Dharmahatu, the void, suchness, and the Godhead. All of these words are simply symbols for the real world of no boundary. Now, the real self is frequently referred to by some sort of appellation suggesting that it is the innermost core of humans, that it is the preeminently subjective, interpersonal, non-objective inside and within. We are told unanimously by the mystics that the kingdom of heaven is within, and that we are to search the depths of our souls until we uncover, hidden in our innermost being, the real self of all existence. As Swami Prabhavananda used to say, who, what do you think you are? Absolutely, basically, fundamentally deep within. End quote. One will often find the real self referred to as something like the inner witness, the absolute seer and knower, one's innermost nature, absolute subjectivity, and so on. Thus, Shankara, master of Vedanta Hinduism, would say, quote, there is a self-existent reality, which is the basis of our consciousness of ego. That reality is the witness of the three states of consciousness, waking, dreaming, sleeping, and is distinct from the five bodily coverings. That reality is a knower in all the states of consciousness. It is aware of the presence or absence of the mind. This is Atman, the Supreme Being, the Ancient. End quote. I take this excellent quote from the Zen master, Shibayama. Quote, it, reality, is absolute subjectivity which transcends both subjectivity and objectivity and freely creates and uses them. It is fundamental subjectivity which can never be objectified or conceptualized and is complete in itself, with the full significance of existence in itself. To call it by these names is already a mistake, a step towards objectification and conceptualization. Master Isai therefore remarked, it is ever unnameable. The absolute subjectivity that can never be objectified or conceptualized is free from the limitations of space and time. It is not subject to life and death, and it goes beyond subject and object, and although it lives in an individual, it is not restricted to the individual. But in saying that, end quote, but in saying that the true real self is the true seer or inner witness or absolute subjectivity within each of us, might seem contradictory in light of what we had said thus far about unity consciousness. For on the one hand, we have seen that the real self is an ever-present no-boundary awareness, wherein the subject and the object, the seer and the seen, the experiencing and the experienced, form a single continuum. Yet, on the other hand, we have just described the real self as the inner witness, the ultimate knower. We said it is the seer and not the seen, it is the inside and not the outside. What are we to make of this seeming contradiction? First, we must recognize that the difficulties the mystic faces in trying to describe the ineffable experience of unity consciousness. Foremost among these is the fact that the real self is a no-boundary awareness, whereas all our words and thoughts are nothing but boundaries. This, however, is not a flaw confined to any particular language, but is inherent in all languages by virtue of their very structure. A language possesses utility only insofar as it can construct conventional boundaries. A language of no boundaries is no language at all, and thus the mystic who tries to speak logically and formally of unity consciousness is doomed to sound very paradoxical or contradictory. The problem is that the structure of any language cannot grasp the nature of unity consciousness any more than a fork could grasp the ocean. So the mystics must be content with pointing and showing a way whereby we may all experience unity consciousness for ourselves. In this sense, the mystic path is a pure experiential one. The mystic asks you to believe nothing on blind faith, to accept no authority but that of your own understanding and experience. They ask you only to try a few experiments in awareness and to look closely at your present state of experience, and to try to see yourself and your world as clearly as you possibly can. Don't think, just look, as Wittgenstein exclaimed. But just where to look? This is precisely the point at which the mystics universally answers, look inside, deep inside, for the real self lies within. Now the mystics are not describing the real self as being inside you, they are pointing inside you. They are indeed saying to look within, not because the final answer actually resides within you and not without, but because as you carefully and consistently look inside, you sooner or later find outside. You realize, in other words, that the inside and the outside, the subject and the object, the seer and the seen, are one, and thus you spontaneously fall into your natural state. So the mystic begins by talking of real self in a way that seems contradictory to everything we said earlier. However, if we follow the mystic through to the end, the conclusion, as we will see, is identical. Start by considering what something like absolute subjectivity or inner witness might mean, at least the way the mystic uses it. Absolute subjectivity would be that which can never, at any time, under any circumstances, be a particular object that can be seen or heard or known or perceived. As the absolute seer, it could never be seen. As the absolute knower, it can never be known. Lao Tzu speaks of it thus, quote, because the eye gazes but can catch no glimpse of it, it is called elusive. Because the ear listens but cannot hear it, it is called rarefied. Because the hand feels it but cannot find it, it is called infinitesimal. End of quote. In order to contact this real self, or absolute subjectivity, most mystics therefore proceed with something like the following from Sir Ramana Maharshi, quote, the gross body which is composed of the 7 humours, I am not. The 5 sense organs which apprehend their respective objects, I am not. Even this mind which thinks, I am not. End of quote. But what then could this real self be? As Ramana points out, it can't be my body because I can feel and know it, and what can be known is not the absolute knower. It can't be my wishes, hopes, or fears, and emotions, for I can come to some degree see and feel them. And what can be seen is not the absolute seer. It can't be my mind, my personality, my thoughts, for all those can be witnessed, and what can be witnessed is not the absolute witness. By persistently looking within for the real self in this fashion, I am, in fact, starting to realize that it cannot be found within at all. I used to think of myself as this little subject in here who watched all these objects out there. But the mystic shows me clearly that this little subject can, in fact, be seen as the object. It is not a real subject, my real self, at all. But just here, according to the mystic, is our major problem in life and living. For most of us imagine that we can feel ourselves, or know ourselves, or perceive ourselves, or at least be aware of ourselves in some sense, so we have the feeling even now. But, replies the mystic, the fact that I can see, or know, or feel myself at this moment shows me conclusively that the self cannot be my real self at all. It is a false self, a pseudo-self, an illusion, and a hoax. We have inadvertently identified with a complex of objects of which we know or can know. Therefore, this complex of knowable objects cannot be the true knower or the real self. We have identified ourselves with our body, mind, and personality, imagining these objects to constitute our real self, and we then spend our entire lives trying to defend, protect, and prolong what is just an illusion. We are the victims of an epidemic case of mistaken identity, and our supreme identity quietly but surely awaiting discovery with our supreme identity. And the mystics want nothing more than to have us awaken to who or what we really and eternally are, beneath or under or prior to our pseudo-self. Thus they ask us to cease identifying with this false self, to realize that whatever I can think, know, or feel about myself cannot constitute my real self. My mind, my body, my thoughts, my desires, these are no more than my real self. These are no more my real self than the trees, the stars, the clouds, the mountains, for I can witness all of them as objects with equal felicity. Proceeding in this fashion, I become transparent to myself and realize that in some sense, what I am goes much, much beyond this isolated, skin-bound organism. The more I go into I, the more I fall out of I. And this investigation is pushed. As this investigation is pushed, a curious flip in consciousness occurs with the Lakvatara Sutra calls, quote, a turning about in the deepest seat of consciousness, unquote. The more I look for the absolute seer, the more I realize I can't find it as an object. And the simple reason I can't find it as a particular object is because it's every object. I can't feel it because it's everything felt. I can't experience it because it is everything experienced. It is true that anything I can see is not the seer, because everything I see is the seer. As I go within and find my real self, I find only the world. But a strange thing has happened now, for I realize that the real self within is actually the real world without, and vice versa. The subject and the object, the inside, the outside, are and always have been non-dual. There is a primary boundary. The world is my body, and I am looking out of, and what I am looking out of is what I am looking at. Because the real self resides neither within or without, and because the subject and object are actually not two, the mystics can speak of reality in many different but only apparently contradictory ways. They can say that in all reality there are no objects whatsoever, or they may state that reality contains no subjects at all, or they can deny the existence of both subject and object, or they may speak of the absolute subjectivity, which transcends yet includes both the relative subject and the relative object. All of these are simply various ways of saying that the inside world and the outside world are just two different names for the single, ever-present state of no-boundary awareness. Perhaps it is now obvious that, despite the complex theoretical formulations which often surround the perennial philosophy, the essence of the mystical message is plain, simple, and straightforward. To look back, in chapters 2 we saw that reality is a union of opposites, or non-dual, since it is symbolic maps and boundaries which appear to separate the opposites into conflicting enemies. To say reality is non-dual is to say reality is no boundary. In chapter 3, we saw that the real world is not a collection of separate and independent things divorced from one another in space and time. Everything and event in the cosmos is mutually interdependent and interrelated with every other thing and event in cosmos. And once again, because it is our symbolic maps and boundaries which present us with the illusions of independent entities, to say the real world contains no separate things is to say that the real world is no boundary. The real world is no boundary. In this chapter, we saw that the discovery of the real world of no boundary is unity consciousness. It is not that in unity consciousness you are looking at the real territory of no boundary. Rather, unity consciousness is the real territory of no boundary. Reality, by all accounts, is no boundary awareness. That is one's real self. Thus, to quote the founder of quantum mechanics, Erwin Schrödinger, quote, "You can throw yourself flat on the ground, stretched out upon Mother Earth, with a certain conviction that you are one with her and she is with you. You are as firmly established, as invulnerable as she, indeed 1,000 times firmer and more invulnerable. As surely as she will engulf you tomorrow, so surely will she bring you forth anew to a new striving and suffering. And not merely some day, now, today, every day she is bringing you forth. Not once, but thousands of times, just as every day she engulfs you 1,000 times over. For eternally and always, there is only now, one and the same now. The present is the only thing that has no end. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. The No Boundary Moment. Need there is, methinks, to understand the sense in which the Scripture speaketh of time and eternity. With these words, St. Dionysius put his finger on the whole crux of mystical insight. For the enlightened sages of all times and places agree that unity consciousness is not temporal, not of time, but eternal, timeless. It knows no beginning, no birth, and no ending, no death. Thus, until we thoroughly grasp the nature of eternity, the sense of the real will elude us. Who, asked St. Augustine, will hold the heart of man, that it may stand still and see how eternity, ever still standing, neither past nor to come, uttereth the times past and to come? Who indeed? For grasping that which is eternal, if in fact such even exists, seems so weighty, momentous, and well-nigh impossible task that we are likely to shrink before it. Modern individuals seem so generally bereft of even the least mystical insight that they shrug off the notion of eternity altogether, or explain it away with positivistic fury, or demand to know what it has to do with practical reality. Yet the mystic claims that eternity is not a philosophical opinion, nor a religious dogma, nor an unattainable ideal. Eternity rather is so simple, so obvious, so present, and so straightforward that we have only to open our eyes in a radically empirical fashion and look. As Zen Master Huang Po used to repeatedly stress, it is right in front of you. Part of the reason that contracting the eternal seems so awesome is that we generally misunderstand the true sense of the word eternity itself. We commonly imagine eternity to be a very, very long time, an unending stretch of years, 1,000,000 times 1,000,000, forever. But the mystic does not understand eternity in that fashion at all, for eternity is not an awareness of everlasting time, but an awareness which is itself totally without time. The eternal moment is a timeless moment, a moment which knows neither past nor future, before nor after, today nor tomorrow, birth nor death. To live in unity consciousness is to live in and as the timeless moment, for nothing obscures the divine light more thoroughly than the taint of time. As Meister Eckhart put, quote, time is what keeps the light from reaching us. There is no greater obstacle to God, unity consciousness, than time. And not only time, but temporalities, not only temporal things, but temporal affectations, not only temporal affectations, but the very taint and smell of time, quote, end quote. Yet, we must ask, what is a timeless moment? What instant is without date or duration? What moment is not just quick or short-lived in time, but absolutely without time? Odd as these questions initially seem, most of us would have to admit that we have known moments, peak moments, which seemed indeed to lie so far beyond time, that the past and the future melted away into obscurity, lost in a sunset transfixed by the play of moonlight on a dark crystal pond which possessed no bottom, floated out of self and time in the enraptured embrace of a loved one, caught and held still, bound by the crack of thunder echoing through mists of rain. Who has not touched the time list? What do all of these experiences have in common? It seems, and the mystic agrees, that time appears suspended in all of these experiences because we are totally absorbed in the present moment. Clearly, in this present moment, if we would but examine it, there is no time. The present moment is a timeless moment, and the timeless moment is an eternal moment, a moment which knows neither past nor future, before nor after, yesterday nor tomorrow. To enter deeply into this present moment is thus to plunge into eternity, to step through the looking glass into the world of the unborn and the undying. For there is no beginning at this present moment, and that which has no beginning is the unborn. That is, search as you will, you cannot find, see, or feel a beginning to your experience of this present moment. When did this present begin? Did it ever begin, or could it possibly be that this present floats so above time that it never entered the temporal stream at any beginning? In the same vein, there is no ending in this present moment, and that which has no ending is the undying. Again, search as you will, you cannot find, see, feel an ending to your experience of this present moment. You never experience an ending to the present, even if you die, since you would not be there to feel anything end. This is why we heard Schopenhauer say that the present is the only thing that has no end. Granted that the outer forms of the present moment cascade by in a bewildering succession, still the present itself remains indestructible, untouched by what we have been taught to interpret as time. In this present moment there is neither past nor future, there is no time, and that which is timeless is eternal. Says Zen Master Seppo, quote, "If you want to know what eternity means, it is no further than this very moment. If you fail to catch it at this present moment, you will not get it, however many times you were reborn in hundreds of thousands of years." So the notion of everlasting time is a monstrosity, impossible to actually conceive, grasp, or experience in any way whatsoever. But the eternal now, this timeless moment, is as simple and as accessible as your own present experience, for the two are one and the same. Thus, said Wittgenstein, eternal life belongs to those who live in the present. Because eternity is the nature of this present and timeless moment, the mystic tells us that the great liberation, the entrance to the kingdom of heaven, the very portal leading beyond the pairs and past and future, exists nowhere and no when else but now. In the words of the Christian sage de Caussade, "O all ye who thirst, know that you have not far to seek for the fountain of living waters. It springs close to you in the present moment. The present moment is the manifestation of the name of God in the kingdom of heaven." Hence, says the Muslim mystic Rumi, the Sufi is a child of the moment. Such quotes could go on forever, taken from the words of the great sages of every major religious and philosophical persuasion, but they would all indicate the same thing. Eternity is not and cannot be found tomorrow. It is not found in 5 minutes. It is not found in 2 seconds. It is already, always now. The present is the only reality. There is no other. And yet it seems, and for reasons soon apparent, I stress the word seems, that so few of us live solely and completely in the now. We dwell in yesterdays and dream forever, or tomorrows, and thus bind ourselves with the torturous chains of time and the ghosts of things not really present. We dissipate our energies in fantasy mists of memories and expectations, and thus deprive the living present of its fundamental reality and reduce it to its spacious present, a slender present that endures a mere 1 or 2 seconds, a pale shadow of the eternal present. Unable to live in the timeless present and bathe in the delights of eternity, we seek an anemic substitute, the mere promises of time, hoping always that the future will bring what the slender present so piteously lacks. And this life in time, according to the mystic, is a life of misery. For the mystic claims that all of our problems are problems of time and problems in time. You might never have looked at it this way, but a moment's consideration reveals the utter obviousness of it. All our problems concern time. Our worries are always over the past or over the future. We lament many of our past actions and dread their future consequences. Our feelings of guilt are inseparably linked to the past and bring with them torments of depression, bitterness, and regrets. If this is not clear, then just imagine what it would be like to live without any scars of your past. So also all anxiety is tied to thoughts of the future, brings with it clouds of dread and catastrophic expectation, the past and the future. These surely are the links to the shackles of our misery, warns the Bhagavad Gita. I am come as time, the waster of peoples, ready for the hour that ripens to their ruin. And yet, in the strict present, there is no fundamental problems, for there is no time. No such animal as present problem exists. And if there seems to be, a closer examination will inevitably reveal that it is really tied up with some past guilt or some future anxiety. For all guilt is a state of being lost in the past, all anxiety is a state of being lost in the future. It is in this state that the mystic claims that all our problems are generated by our vivid sensation of it, and bondage to time. As Stephen lamented in Ulysses, history is a nightmare from which I am trying to awaken. And as Emerson so brilliantly pointed out, this awakening occurs only as we become present to the present. I quote, "These roses under my window make no reference to former roses or to better ones. They are for what they are. They exist with God today. There is no time for them. There is simply the rose. It is perfect in every moment of its existence. But man postpones or remembers. He does not live in the present, but with reverted eye laments the past, or heedless of the riches that surround him, stands up to tiptoe to foresee the future. He cannot be happy and strong until he too lives with nature in the present, above time." End of quote. To live in the present above time, and to be a child of the moment, thus seems to be the crux of the whole matter of eternity and unity consciousness. For the timeless present is none other than the straight and narrow way which is said to lead from time to eternity, from death to immortality. And yet we must be very careful at this point in our understanding, for this living in the timeless present, this bare attention to the present moment, has nothing to do with the common psychological trick of just forgetting about yesterday and tomorrow. The mystics are not saying that we should live in the present by forgetting about or trying to ignore the past and future. They are saying, and at first this will sound worse, that there is no past and future, for the past and future are simply the illusory products of a symbolic boundary superimposed upon the eternal now, a symbolic boundary which appears in the split eternity into yesterday versus tomorrow, before versus after, time gone versus time to come. Thus time, as a boundary upon eternity, is not a problem to get rid of, but an illusion which doesn't exist in the first place. So we must, at this point, be very careful to proceed with utmost caution in order to understand this eternal awareness correctly. Many people, after theoretically grasping that eternity is not everlasting time, but the timeless present, try to contact this timeless presence by concentrating their attention on the now moment, on whatever they are presently experiencing. They practice bare attention to the immediate present in an attempt to contact the timeless now moment. But as remarkably as that sounds, it nevertheless is beside the point, for trying to contact this now moment still requires another now moment in which this contact may occur. In other words, trying to live in the timeless present requires time. Trying to pay attention to the present requires a future in which this attention might be paid. And yet we are not talking about some future in which this now moment is grasped. We are talking about just this now moment. One cannot, in short, use time to get out of time. By doing so, we just reinforce that which we wish to uproot. This is exasperating only because we constantly assume we aren't already living in the eternal now, and that therefore we must take steps that will ensure at some future time that we will live as in the eternal now. In other words, we assume time is real and then try to destroy it. Worse, we try to destroy time by time, and that will never work. So, as always, the mystics do not ask us to try to destroy illusions. They ask us only to carefully look at them. For if time actually does exist, we needn't worry about trying to destroy it. Thus, before we try to get rid of time, let's see if we can find it first. But if we look for time and can't find it, then we will already have glimpsed the timelessness. We have seen that direct experience shows us that there is no separate self standing apart from the world of experience. Likewise, in just the same way, we will now look at direct experience for any evidence as to whether or not time, the flow from past to future, actually exists. Let us begin with our senses. Do we ever sense time? That is, do we ever directly sense the past or future? Start again with hearing. For the moment, concentrate your attention on just your auditory field and notice the flux of sounds kaleidoscoping through your awareness. You might be able to hear people talking, dogs barking, kids playing, perhaps the wind blowing, rain splashing, faucet dripping, or maybe you can hear the house creaking or the horns, cars honking, or someone laughing. But notice all these sounds are present sounds. You cannot hear past sounds, nor can you hear future sounds. The only thing you ever hear is the present. You do not and cannot hear a past or a future. Just as all sounds are only present sounds, so all tastes are only present tastes, and all smells are only present smells, and all sights are present sights. You cannot touch, see, or feel anything resembling a past or future. In other words, in your direct and immediate awareness, there is no time, no past, no future, only an endless changing present, shorter than a millisecond, yet never coming to an end. All direct awareness is timeless awareness. And yet, what is it that gives me the overwhelming impression that I am aware of time, especially of time past, of my whole personal history, of all the things that were? For although I certainly understand that in my direct experience there is no past, only an endless present, I nevertheless am firmly convinced that I know something in the past. And no verbal sleight of hand can convince me otherwise, for there is something which speaks clearly and forcibly to me of things which happened a moment ago, a minute ago, days ago, or even years ago. What is that, and how it can be denied? The answer to the first question seems obvious. It is memory, for although I do not directly see the past, nor feel it, nor touch it, I can remember it. Memory alone assumes me that there was a past, and, in fact, were it not for memory, I would have no idea of time whatever, or whatsoever. Further, I notice that other people seem to have a memory also, and that they all substantially report the same sort of past that I recall. And so I assume memory gives me a knowledge of the actual past, even if I can't directly experience the past. But here, right here, claim the mystics, I have made a false mistake. The mystics agree that when I think of the past, all I really know is a certain memory. But they add, that memory is itself a present experience. Alan Watts elaborates, quote, "But what about memories? Surely, by remembering, I can also know what is past. Very well, remember something. Remember the incident of seeing a friend walking down the street. What are you aware of? You are not actually watching the veritable event of your friend walking down the street. You can't go up and shake hands with him, or even get an answer to a question you forgot to ask him at the past time that you are remembering. In other words, you are not looking at the actual past at all. You are looking at the present trace of the past. From memories you infer that there have been past events, but you are not aware of any past events. You know the past only in the present, as part of the present." End quote. Thus, I never know the actual past at all. I know only memories of the past, and those memories exist only as a present experience. Further, when what we call the past actually occurred, it is a present occurrence. At no point, therefore, am I ever directly aware of the actual past. In the same way, I never know the future. I know only anticipations or expectations, which nevertheless are themselves part of the present experience. Anticipation, like memory, is a present fact. To see that the past as memory and the future as anticipation are both present facts is to see all time existing now. With this understanding, the saying of the mystics on time and eternity becomes clear. For instance, read Meister Eckhart's famous statement on the two types of biblical days. Quote, "There are more days than one. There is the soul's day and God's day. A day, whether 6 or 7 ago, or more than 6,000 years ago, is just as near to the present as to yesterday. Why? Because all time is contained in the present, now moment. The soul's day falls within this time and consists of a natural light in which things are seen. God's day, however, is the complete day, comprising both day and night. In the real now moment, the past and the future are both far from God and alien from his way." End of quote. Or Nicholas de Cusa, quote, "All temporal succession coincides in one and the same eternal now. So there is nothing past or future." End quote. And we can understand why Dante could speak of that incredible moment to which all times are present. So it is that our bondage to time and all its problems is a vast illusion. There is no time but now, and the only thing you ever experience is the eternal present, whatever its outward forms may be. But most of us usually feel that our present moment is hardly an eternal one. We feel instead that our present moment is a slender present, a fleeting present, lasting about 1, maybe 2 seconds. This is what the Christian mystics call the nunc fluens, which means the passing present. Another way to say this is that we feel our present moment is bounded and limited. It seems to be sandwiched in between the past and the future. For through a confusion of memory symbols with fact, we impose a boundary upon the timeless present, severing it into the opposites of past versus future, and then conceive of time as a moment from the past through our fleeting present to the future. We introduce a boundary into the territory of eternity and thereby fence ourselves in. Our passing present, then, seems bounded on the one side by the past and on the other side to the future by the future. The past seems to be something real and substantial behind me and something real that I look backward to. Many people feel that the past lies not only behind them, but to their left, probably because we read from left to right. At any rate, because we imagine memory to point to a real past, that past appears to lie behind our present. It therefore limits our present and seems to stand against it from behind, from the left, from outside. On the other side of our passing present lies the future. It too seems very real and substantial, a little more uncertain than the past, of course, because we can only guess what it will be like. But that it is there seems certain. The future bounds our present to the front, ahead of us, to the right of us, because we imagine expectation to point to a real future. The future seems to lie in front of my present, it therefore bounds my present. From all sides, then, our present is bounded, sandwiched in between the past and the future. It is limited, fenced, restricted. It is not an open moment. It is a squeezed moment, a pressed moment, and therefore a fleeting moment. It just passes. Since the past and the future seem real, our present moment, the very meat of the sandwich, is reduced to a mere thin slice, so that our reality becomes all bread ends with no filling. But when it is seen that the past as memory is always a present experience, the boundary behind the moment collapses. It becomes obvious that nothing came before this present. And likewise, when it is seen that the future of expectation is always a present experience, the boundary ahead of the moment explodes. The whole weight of there being something behind us or in front of us quickly, suddenly, and completely vanishes. The present is no longer hemmed in, but expands to fill all time, and thus the pressing moment unfolds into an eternal present, which the Christian mystics called nunc stans. The nunc fluens, or passing present, returns to the nunc stans, or eternal present, and this present is no mere slice of reality. The contrary, in this now resides the cosmos, with all the time and space in the world. Now this nunc stans, the nunc stans is a no-boundary moment. It has no boundaries because the past as memory and the future as expectation are in it, not around it. Because there is no past and no future outside the moment, there are no boundaries to this moment. Nothing came before it, nothing comes after it. You never experience a beginning to it, you never experience an end to it. Says the Platform Sutra, quote, "In this moment there is nothing which comes to be. In this moment there is nothing which ceases to be. There is no birth and death to be brought to an end. Thus the absolute peace in this present moment. Though it is at this moment, there is no boundary or limit to this moment, and herein is eternal delight." End quote. Thus it is not true that the mystics flee time by keeping their nose glued to the immediate present, thereby shirking their responsibilities in the present world of history. If this charge were true, then the mystics would be interested only in the fleeting present, or the 1 or 2 second nunc fluens. But they are not. Their awareness floats instead in the eternal present, the nunc stans. They do not so much flee time as embrace all time. They are perfectly free to ponder the past and the future, but through the realization that these ponderings too are but present events. They are never bound by past and future. The past as memory does not push against them. The past as memory does not push them, and the future as expectation does not pull them. For this present includes past and future, and thus has nothing outside it which can exert a push or a pull. They are not in time at all, for all time is in them. Finally, we might ask, what has the eternal now, the nunc stans, to do with unity consciousness? Is there any relation between them? The answer is that there is no relationship between them because they are one and the same thing. As Aldous Huxley put it, quote, "The eternal now is consciousness." As we are referring to it, a unity consciousness. Unity consciousness lives as the realization that one's true self is no boundary, embracing the cosmos as a mirror its objects. As we saw in the last chapter, the major apparent obstacle to unity consciousness is the primary boundary. which leads us to erroneously identify ourselves with only the small self in here, which we fancy has experiences of the world out there. However, as Krishnamurti has so often pointed out, the separate self, the little man within, is composed entirely of memories. That is, what you now feel to be the inner observer reading this page is nothing but a complex of past memories. Your likes and dislikes, your hopes and fears, your ideas and principles, all based on memories. As soon as someone asks, "Who are you? Tell me about yourself," you will begin to search your memory for pertinent facts which you have done, seen, felt, or accomplished in the past. Indeed, claims Krishnamurti, the very feelings that you now exist as a separate entity is itself based entirely on memory. If you get a good grip of yourself, you are holding nothing but a memory. Of course, Krishnamurti adds, there is nothing whatsoever wrong with remembering the past, for this is essential in this world. Problematic, however, is the fact that we identify with these memories as if they existed outside or apart from the now moment, that is, as if they embodied a knowledge of an actual outside past. But look what this means. Because we believe that memory stands outside present experience, the memory self likewise seems to stand outside present experience. The self then seems to have present experiences instead of being present experiences. The feeling that memory is a past experience behind the present moment is the very same feeling as the self being a separate entity behind present experience. The observer seems to stand outside. Now, only because memory seems to actually be a past experience. The observer is memory. If memory seems different from the now, then the observer feels different from the now. Yet, by the same token, when all memory is understood and seen to be a present experience, then the basis of a self standing apart from the present totally collapses. Yourself, which is just a memory, thus becomes only another present experience. It is not something which has a present experience. As the past merges into the present, you, as observer, likewise merge into the present. You can no longer stand aside from this moment, and there is no place outside this moment. Thus, to see all memory as present experience is to collapse the boundaries of the present moment, to free it of illusory limits, to deliver it from the opposite of past versus future. It becomes obvious that there is nothing behind you in time, nor before you in time. You thus have nowhere to stand but in the timeless present, and thus nowhere to stand but in eternity.
Here's commentary. There are two things that I really enjoyed and helped me in reading this part of the book. One of them was that he makes sense and helps to see how the different wisdoms and traditions work together. So instead of contrasting them or showing it as, this is one way to go and this is another, or that they don't really fit, which is the way that most people say it. Well, when you say spiritual in one tradition or in another tradition, it means something different, etc. Our consciousness is a great example. He shows how it all fits together, and I think that that's really helpful and really important to the work of transformation of individuals and societies and hopefully our planet before it's too late. I think that language is really the key. I've said this many times, but I really love what Terence McKenna said about how humans, and I would add my own, to our own perception have stopped evolving. So I don't think that's really true, but it's the way that we perceive it because we're so bound in our own universe of self. But how we've perceived ourselves to have evolved, and so that now our evolution is through our culture, and that the culture's DNA is language. And so I think the work here that Ken Wilber is doing in terms of explaining things is really helpful. The other thing that was really helpful to me and that I really liked is how he normalizes, I would say, in sort of Buddhist terms, enlightenment experiences, and how the Buddha repeatedly talks about how in other Buddhist teachings, how enlightenment is right there. It's just always right there. And I think that part of that is that we experience it even in our daily lives. We just don't have a language for it. Certainly as children we experience it consistently, I think, unless we're really beat down. but even then, it's in us. And so just giving a language to it is really helpful. Um, so the thing that I thought was interesting and funny was how he talks about Aristotle and a little bit, I think slightly judging him. And what I thought was interesting is that Wilber reminds me a bit of Aristotle. I remember reading Aristotle when I was young. I was studying Latin and Greek and reading Aristotle, and then I took some philosophy and thought that Aristotle was like this madman, this mad scientist who was like basically kind of creating the world of logos that we have today, this left brain world where he's like taking all of the different pieces and ingredients and like creating recipes to describe what the world is, and thereby in a sense creating it as we know it today, what we call the Western world. Although I agree with what Campbell says is that there really isn't a distinction anymore between East and West the way that we had thought of it. And if you think about those kinds of distinctions, they're really based on a lot of ugly biases and prejudices. So anyway, I just think it's interesting that Wilber is, he decries a bit the left brain world and the world of creating order with words and these recipe makers, Adam, etc. And that's what he is in a lot of ways. So um, it's sort of funny, um, but enjoyable and helpful. And I thank you if you listened, and I'll be reading more of this and posting it. Bye.